Buenos días a todos, bienvenidos a esta primera jornada de la CNMV de recuperación y resolución de entidades de contrapartida central. Yo en primer lugar quiero agradecer a Antonio Romero como representante de CaixaBank en este evento el habernos cedido las instalaciones para celebrar la conferencia de la CNMV que acabo de mencionar. Me es imposible hoy estar ahí físicamente con todos vosotros, pero no he querido perder la oportunidad de daros la bienvenida y de agradecer vuestra participación. El objetivo de esta jornada es dar a conocer la nueva regulación acerca de las entidades de contrapartida central y facilitar también el debate con la industria, con las autoridades competentes y con el mundo académico. El momento, además, que tiene lugar esta conferencia me parece especialmente oportuno, pues a partir del próximo mes de agosto tendrá lugar la efectiva aplicación del Reglamento Europeo sobre Recuperación y Resolución de Entidades de Contrapartida Central. Y esperamos además en ese reglamento también la designación de la CNMV, de la Comisión Nacional de Mercado de Valores, como autoridad de resolución. Las entidades de contrapartida central han ganado un peso y una relevancia creciente desde, incluso si nos vamos desde la gran crisis financiera de 2008. Estas infraestructuras de mercado, al fin y al cabo, al interponerse entre el vendedor y el comprador, juegan un papel clave en la reducción y gestión del riesgo de contrapartida y bien ordenadas hacen el sistema de compraventa de valores pues, más seguro y más eficiente. Pero también es cierto que su importancia sistémica ha ido en aumento, especialmente tras la incorporación de los derivados OTC, por ejemplo, en la compensación centralizada. Todo esto ha reforzado el papel de estas infraestructuras como entidades críticas o, como suele decirse, como entidades demasiado importantes o demasiado grandes para caer, el too big to fail. El reglamento que mencionaba sobre recuperación y resolución de entidades de contrapartida central completa el conjunto de reformas regulatorias en la Unión Europea que se derivan de la crisis de 2008, que tras el acuerdo del G20, y precisamente lo que busca es hacer estas infraestructuras clave más resilientes ante situaciones de crisis. Y como no puede ser de otra forma, dado el carácter global de la actividad de compensación y las elevadas interconexiones, necesariamente tenemos que partir de una regulación armonizada a nivel internacional, que se asienta en los principios globales adoptados tras la crisis financiera. Y aquí me refiero, por una parte, a los principios para las infraestructuras del mercado financiero, PFMMI por sus siglas en inglés, que se acordaron por CPMI y OSCO en 2011, y por otra parte a los atributos clave o los key attributes de los regímenes de resolución efectivos para instituciones financieras aprobados por el Consejo de Estabilidad Financiera, el Financial Stability Board, en 2011, inicialmente para el sistema bancario y que luego fueron adaptados a las infraestructuras de mercado en 2014. Los primeros abordaban precisamente el régimen prudencial y de gestión de riesgos de las entidades de contrapartida central europeas y tuvieron su reflejo en el ámbito europeo en el reglamento EMIR. Y lo segundo, los Key Attributes, abordan el problema precisamente que mencionaba de demasiado grandes para caer o el too big to fail. Y para ello, en caso de tener que gestionar la falta de viabilidad de estas entidades, se define todo un marco de resolución ordenado, manteniendo la continuidad de las funciones críticas y evitando pues tener incluso que recurrir a fondos públicos o a fondos de los contribuyentes. De este modo, la resiliencia, la recuperación y la resolución de las entidades de contrapartida central son las tres Rs esenciales que están estrechamente vinculadas entre sí, pues al fin y al cabo tener mecanismos sólidos ayudan a reducir la probabilidad de que sea necesario entrar en fase de recuperación y de resolución y a su vez los acuerdos, simplemente el hecho de los acuerdos de recuperación y resolución mantienen los incentivos necesarios para garantizar la resiliencia en la fase de continuidad. La aprobación y aplicación del Reglamento Europeo que he mencionado, de recuperación y resolución, otorga a las entidades de contrapartida central sistémicas en más de una jurisdicción, y entre ellas tenemos a la española BME Clearing, pues un marco de recuperación y resolución ajustado a estos estándares internacionales. ¿Y cuáles son los pilares de este reglamento? ¿Cuáles son las principales características? Aquí solo quiero destacar tres de ellas. En primer lugar, el reglamento detalla la necesidad de contar con planes de recuperación que elabora la propia entidad y con planes de resolución. Y estos son los que nos ayudarían o los que nos ayudan precisamente a prevenir y a estar preparados para reaccionar ante dificultades financieras y son, en mi opinión, el pilar más importante que sustenta todo el marco. En segundo lugar, define la capacidad de la autoridad supervisora competente que se haya definido de intervenir en una fase temprana, antes de que los problemas se vuelvan críticos y la situación financiera pues ya se deteriore de una forma irreparable. Y por último, en tercer lugar, si todo lo anterior falla y se apreciase interés público, se concreta la posibilidad de implementar medidas de resolución para absorber pérdidas y para reestructurar o vender la entidad o parte de su negocio. Este marco, el reglamento, pues se va a completar con un conjunto de desarrollos técnicos y también con la designación de la CNMV como la autoridad de resolución de entidades de contrapartida central. Y aquí, permíteme, quiero destacar que la CNMV ha mantenido una elevada involucración en el desarrollo de estos estándares, tanto a nivel europeo como internacional, y de hecho copreside el Grupo de Resolución de Infraestructuras de Mercado del Consejo de Estabilidad Financiera. La conferencia de hoy persigue precisamente profundizar sobre las implicaciones de la regulación y creo que interesa a toda la industria financiera que desarrolla su actividad a través de las diferentes cámaras, ya sea como miembros, como clientes o como prestadores de los servicios. Y para hablar de todos estos temas tenemos la suerte de contar hoy con representantes de autoridades españolas, europeas e internacionales. Además de la CNMV, tenemos al Ministerio de Economía y Transformación Digital, tenemos al Financial Stability Board, tenemos CMP y OSCO, así como también representantes de la industria financiera, con asociaciones propia BME Clearing, entidades financieras y académicos de reconocido prestigio en el mundo financiero. Cerrará la sesión el director general del Tesoro y Política Financiera, Pablo Ramón Laca. Y voy terminando. La resolución de las entidades de contrapartida central es un tema complejo, no cabe duda, pero también desafiante en términos legales, económicos y operativos, donde hay múltiples intereses y en ocasiones divergentes que requieren de una complicada estructura de incentivos. Y es en todo caso un trabajo necesario que nos tiene que ayudar precisamente a no tener que aplicarlo efectivamente nunca. Pero las crisis pasan y los acontecimientos convulsos, como los que hemos visto derivados de la pandemia o la reciente crisis de Ucrania y sus efectos en los mercados de materias primas existen. Hacemos todo lo posible para que no sucedan, pero una vez se desencadenan, lo importante es estar preparados y tener marcos ordenados para actuar consecuentemente. Y más si pensamos que estamos en un momento crucial y desafiante para el mundo de la compensación centralizada. Y no solo por los riesgos que acabo de mencionar, que también, sino también por los inciertos impactos que pueden tener tendencias globales como la innovación tecnológica. Y me refiero aquí a la aplicación de la tecnología de registros distribuidos o DLT, la compensación de nuevos tipos de activos digitales, los riesgos relacionados con la ciberseguridad, por ejemplo, o la integración de los riesgos derivados del cambio climático, entre otros. En la UE, en la Unión Europea, además, tras el Brexit, hay un nuevo equilibrio y las entidades de contrapartida central más importantes para los mercados de la Unión Europea se han convertido en mercados extraterritoriales, lo que puede, no cabe duda, aportar retos adicionales. Todo ello, todo lo que acabo de mencionar, acentúa la importancia de contar con una gestión eficaz de los riesgos y de reforzar las líneas de defensa y la resolubilidad en el mundo de la compensación centralizada. Confío en que la sesión de hoy nos ayude a todos a profundizar en su conocimiento y en su mejor comprensión. Gracias por vuestra atención y os dejo que disfrutéis del resto de la jornada. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días a todos, bienvenidos a esta conferencia sobre recuperación y resolución de entidades de contrapartida central. Gracias, como ha dicho la vicepresidenta CaixaBank, por permitirnos celebrar hoy aquí esta sesión. Quería también aprovechar para dar las gracias a todas las personas que nos están siguiendo en streaming a través del canal de YouTube de la CNMV y a través de LinkedIn. Y entramos de esta forma en el primer bloque de presentaciones que vamos a tener en el día de hoy. En primer lugar, como no puede ser de otra manera, pues dedicado al contexto internacional y a los aspectos que nutrirán la agenda del Consejo de Estabilidad Financiera. Para ello tenemos también la enorme suerte o el privilegio de contar con la intervención de Martin J. Grunberg, que es el actual presidente del Comité de Resolución del Financial Stability Board. Martin, además, es también el presidente del FEDIC de los Estados Unidos, del Federal Insurance Deposit Corporation. Y bueno, él va a hacer una intervención online, como os podéis imaginar, no solamente por cuestiones de diferencia horaria con Washington, sino también por su apretada agenda como presidente del FEDIC, pues no queda otra que hacer esta intervención online. Además, tengo que señalar también que precisamente mañana comienza una reunión presencial desde que se empezó la pandemia, pues del Resolution Steering Committee, del Comité de Resolución del FSB. Sin más preámbulos, doy paso a la intervención de Martin Grunberg, presidente del REGI.
Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I welcome this opportunity to share my views as chairman of the Resolution Steering Group of the Financial Stability Board. I'd like to thank CNMV for hosting this important conference on the recovery and resolution of central counterparties. CCP resolution is a top priority of the ResG. I'd also like to thank Maria Jose Gomez-Ubero, the head of resolution and financial stability issues for CNMV and the organizer of this conference. In addition to her role at CNMV, Maria co-chairs the ResG subgroup that focuses on central counterparty resolution. I'd like to acknowledge her leadership on this critical financial stability issue. The ability of authorities to manage the orderly resolution of systemically important financial institutions is a foundation of financial stability. The 2008-2009 global financial crisis made this lesson clear. At that time, authorities lacked the capabilities to manage the orderly failure of systemically important financial institutions. They had to resort to disorderly wind down or public support to mitigate the risks that failure of those institutions presented to the financial system. There was a global commitment in the aftermath of that experience to develop the capabilities to deal with this issue. The Financial Stability Board was created to address these types of cross-border risks, and the Resolution Steering Group of the FSB is the primary global forum for the development of standards and guidance for resolution regimes and for recovery and resolution planning and execution for systemically important financial institutions. As a result of the experience of the global financial crisis, G20 leaders agreed in 2009 on a comprehensive reform agenda for over-the-counter derivatives markets, with the objectives of improving transparency, mitigating systemic risk, and protecting against market abuse. This included an expectation for clearing all standardized contracts through central counterparties, or CCPs. Progress in implementing the G20 regulatory reforms has dramatically increased the share of derivatives cleared at CCPs, and as a result, it has also greatly increased their systemic importance and brought greater attention to their resolvability. As CCPs have grown in importance for the functioning of financial markets, the FSB has taken on and continues to work on core issues relating to CCP resolvability. We're focused on deepening the FSB's resolution policy framework in order to avoid or mitigate serious adverse effects on financial stability. The continued work by RESG seeks to strengthen the implementation of the key attributes of effective resolution regimes for financial institutions to enhance the prospects for CCP resolvability without resort to government bailout and without resulting in contagion to other parts of the financial system. This work by RESG complements the work undertaken by the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures, CPMI, and the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO, on the resilience and recovery of CCPs. Our cooperation across these groups is essential to making progress on these issues. The FSB's guidance on CCP resolution and resolution planning, adopted in July of 2017, was an important step forward. Since 2017, the FSB, in coordination with CPMI and IOSCO, has published the list of CCPs identified as systemically important in more than one jurisdiction. This encouraged regulators to take steps to enhance resolvability of CCPs domiciled in their jurisdictions, including setting up crisis management groups with cooperation agreements to support resolution planning and resolvability assessments. The list of CCPs that are systemically important in one jurisdiction, as of today, includes 13 CCPs from 10 jurisdictions. In November of 2020, the FSB published guidance to help authorities as they assess the adequacy of financial resources for CCP resolution and the treatment of CCP equity in the context of resolution. The guidance provides direction for assessing the adequacy of a CCP's financial resources and the potential financial stability implications of their use. It also provides a framework for resolution authorities to evaluate the exposure of CCP equity to losses in recovery, liquidation, and resolution, and potential treatment of CCP equity in resolution. Authorities completed in 2021 a first round of resolvability assessments for CCPs that are systemic in more than one jurisdiction, and now are continuing this analysis on an annual basis. The resolvability work has shown progress in applying the 2020 guidance. However, our work is far from done. The focus for RESG at this point is on resources to support CCP resolution. We are undertaking a careful and thorough review of potential alternative financial resources to support resolution, including an analysis of associated costs and benefits. RESG is expected to produce a status report by the end of 2022. This current RESG work draws on a previous initiative undertaken in 2021 at the direction of the chairs of the FSB, CPMI, IOSCO, and RESG. The report of that previous initiative was finalized and published in early March 2022 with an invitation for stakeholder feedback. From my perspective as RESG chair, that report was a helpful contribution to our consideration of these issues and a guide for next steps. It concluded that ensuring an adequate set of resolution tools to cover both default and non-default losses in case of a need continues to be important. The RESG is committed to following through on this work and making a contribution to addressing the challenge of CCP resolution. Let me conclude by once again thanking CNMV for hosting this conference, for inviting me to participate, and for focusing attention on this issue. I have no doubt that we will benefit and learn from your discussions today. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Mi más sincero agradecimiento a Martín por su tiempo y por su intervención de hoy. Y permítanme a continuación compartir algunas reflexiones adicionales sobre los avances de los miembros del FSB en la implementación de las reformas que afectan a la resolución de las entidades de contrapartida central, las CCPs, conocidas como CCPs por sus siglas en inglés. Martin, en su intervención, se ha referido al trabajo del RESGI y ha mencionado los avances en materia de aplicación de los Key Attributes, de los principios generales sobre regímenes de resolución efectiva. Ha mencionado también la orientación sobre resolución y sobre planificación que se aprobó en 2017. Ha mencionado la orientación sobre recursos financieros disponibles en resolución que se aprobó en 2020 y ha citado también, como continuación de estos trabajos, el trabajo que actualmente desarrolla el FSB junto con CPMI y IOSCO sobre suficiencia de recursos financieros y posibilidad de contar con recursos financieros alternativos. En todo caso, permítanme señalar que este trabajo en curso del FSB, del que seguramente hablaremos a lo largo de la sesión de hoy, no está concluido. Es un trabajo exploratorio que contará indudablemente con la industria, con el mundo académico en su ejecución y que se llevarán a cabo las consultas públicas que sean precisas para considerar adecuadamente todas las posiciones y todos los intereses en juego. No hay que olvidar que reforzar la resiliencia y la resolubilidad de las entidades de contrapartida central es una tarea compleja, como bien señalaba la vicepresidenta, y esta tarea no puede ser abordada de manera aislada o individual por parte de los reguladores y de las autoridades. Por el contrario, es un trabajo conjunto de colaboración público-privada, especialmente en el ámbito del negocio de la compensación tan central en el sistema financiero y además basado en un delicado equilibrio de incentivos que en todo caso hay que respetar. Y entrando ya en los avances de los miembros del FSB, quisiera señalar que desde el Grupo de Resolución de Infraestructuras de Mercado, que tengo el honor de copresidir, se monitorea el proceso de evaluación de la resolubilidad de las entidades de contrapartida central por parte de las autoridades miembros del FSB, de este grupo. La CNMV, como saben, está previsto que sea designada formalmente Autoridad de Resolución de Entidades de Contrapartida Central y viene desarrollando este trabajo en cumplimiento de los principios y de las recomendaciones del FSB desde hace ya unos cuantos años. Como les decía, el FSB lleva a cabo el seguimiento de la aplicación de estos principios en relación con las ECC sistémicas. Como señalaba Martin, a día de hoy son 13 las entidades de contrapartida central consideradas sistémicas de modo internacional en más de una jurisdicción. Tras el Brexit, 6 de estas entidades de contrapartida central están ubicadas en la Unión Europea y una de ellas es la Cámara que sirve a los mercados de derivados y de contado españoles, BM Clearing. Puedo citar que los hallazgos del seguimiento que se ha hecho por parte del Grupo de Resolución de Infraestructuras en cuanto al seguimiento de la resolubilidad se pueden resumir en 4 puntos. En primer lugar, señalar que todas las ECC, todas las cámaras sistémicas internacionalmente cuentan con un Crisis Management Group, un grupo de gestión de crisis, del que forman parte las autoridades de supervisión relevantes y las autoridades de resolución. También todos estos grupos de gestión de crisis han firmado o están en proceso de firmar acuerdos de cooperación para regular el intercambio de información entre las autoridades miembros. En tercer lugar, una vez aprobado el Reglamento Europeo sobre Recuperación y Resolución de Entidades de Contrapartida Central, todas las jurisdicciones a nivel mundial que cuentan con entidades de infraestructuras sistémicas internacionalmente, cuentan todas estas jurisdicciones con un régimen legal de resolución ajustado o adaptado a los principios aprobados por el IOSCO, por el FSB en 2011. Y desde un punto de vista más práctico, también puedo señalar que las autoridades de origen en cada una de estas jurisdicciones, todas ellas, han avanzado en la evaluación de la resolubilidad de sus CCPs. Se ha iniciado también la planificación de la resolución en prácticamente todas las entidades de contrapartida central, considerando escenarios tanto de pérdida por incumplimiento de los miembros como de pérdida por motivos diferentes al incumplimiento. Y también se han iniciado evaluaciones cualitativas y cuantitativas sobre los recursos financieros necesarios para afrontar escenarios de resolución, de cuantificación de pérdidas y costes de resolución y los posibles gaps entre unos y otros. En este ámbito me gustaría mencionar también que durante el ejercicio 2021 el FSB, junto con el Comité de Supervisión Bancaria de Basilea y CPMI y IOSCO, se organizaron unos talleres para autoridades de supervisión y de resolución durante 2021, como decía, para evaluar y discutir el impacto que sobre la estabilidad financiera podían tener precisamente la aplicación de herramientas de recuperación y de resolución en entidades de contrapartida central. En este caso, las lecciones y los hallazgos también pueden agruparse en tres categorías. Por una parte, en la necesidad de seguir trabajando en la suficiencia del conjunto de recursos y herramientas existentes para la resolución de entidades de contrapartida central y de profundizar en la comprensión de las interconexiones y las interdependencias y en los impactos acumulativos y de segunda ronda de los diferentes instrumentos de resolución. En segundo lugar, en la necesidad de prestar especial atención también a los escenarios de pérdidas no relacionadas con el incumplimiento de los miembros, ¿no? Lo que se conoce como las non-default losses. Y en tercer lugar, en promover y mejorar la cooperación intersectorial y transfronteriza, incluida la ampliación también de los marcos de intercambio de información. Estas conclusiones, sin duda, van a alimentar la agenda del FSB en los próximos años, que de este modo se enfocará, como no puede ser de otra manera, a continuar monitoreando los procesos de evaluación de resolubilidad y de planificación de la resolución, continuará profundizando en la suficiencia del conjunto de herramientas y recursos financieros para la resolución de las entidades de contrapartida central, en mejorar la preparación operativa de las autoridades y en la cooperación y coordinación transfronteriza e intersectorial. También está previsto prestar atención a los retos a los que se enfrentan las autoridades de resolución como resultado de tendencias como la innovación digital, aunque esto se hará una vez que se haya avanzado en este ámbito en el sector bancario. Y para terminar, me gustaría referirme brevemente a la Unión Europea y a la situación de España en particular. Como decía, con la aprobación del reglamento que hoy nos convoca, que entrará en aplicación a partir de agosto de este año, a partir de agosto del 22, como decía antes, todas las jurisdicciones con entidades sistémicas cuentan con un régimen de recuperación y de resolución ajustado a los principios internacionales, tanto de CPMI y IOSCO como del FSB. Su efectiva aplicación va a conllevar retos importantes tanto para la CNMV como autoridad prevista de resolución en España, que deberá afrontar la implantación de la normativa tanto de nivel 1 como de nivel 2, lo que conlleva la puesta en marcha de una serie de medidas procedimentales y organizativas. Sin embargo, debo señalar que, en este sentido, la CNMV ha desarrollado ya un trabajo preparatorio desde 2018, con la creación, por ejemplo, del CMG, del Crisis Management Group, de la Cámara de Contrapartida Central Española, la que sirve a los mercados españoles fundamentalmente, y ha estado involucrada la CNMV desde el comienzo en la negociación y en la elaboración de la normativa, tanto de nivel 1, tanto del reglamento, como de nivel 2, en los grupos que lidera ESMA. Y desde una perspectiva más global, me gustaría también señalar que este reglamento comienza su andadura en un momento crucial y desafiante para el mundo de la compensación centralizada. Como apuntaba la vicepresidenta en su intervención inicial, hemos vivido acontecimientos convulsos, turbulencias en los mercados de la energía, de las materias primas, de la renta variable, de los criptoactivos y además caracterizado por incertidumbres que pueden afectar al negocio del clearing, pues relacionadas con las tendencias como la innovación financiera, la innovación digital, etc. Es cierto que las entidades de contrapartida central han demostrado su fortaleza en tiempos de crisis, pero las situaciones vividas y las incertidumbres futuras acrecientan la importancia de una gestión eficaz del riesgo y del fortalecimiento de las líneas de defensa y de la resolubilidad en el mundo de la compensación centralizada. Y termino aquí subrayando, como bien señalaba Martín en su intervención, que nuestro trabajo está lejos de haberse completado. La resolución de las CCPs es una tarea compleja, como ya se ha dicho varias veces. Los reguladores seguimos trabajando en el marco de la resolución de estas infraestructuras, porque, como todos ustedes bien saben, mantener la continuidad de las funciones críticas de compensación central es crucial para la estabilidad financiera. Y la estabilidad financiera, en palabras del presidente del FSB, de Klasnot, es un bien precioso que no puede darse por sentado. Muchísimas gracias por su atención.
Bueno, para continuar con la agenda prevista, vamos a dar paso a Daniela Russo. Daniela es copresidenta del Policy Steering Group de CPMI IOSCO y, a su vez, asesora del Comité Ejecutivo del Banco Central Europeo. Daniela se va a referir en su presentación al trabajo en curso de CPMI IOSCO sobre resistencia y recuperación de entidades de contrapartida central. En esta ocasión, la intervención se va a desarrollar en formato online. Por favor, Daniela.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, dear señoras y señores, it is a great pleasure for me to speak at this conference today, and I would like to thank María José and la Comisión Nacional de Mercados de Valores for providing me with this opportunity. My only regret is that I've been not able to come in Madrid, but I do hope there will be other opportunities in the future. As I know the agenda is full, so I will try to be brief, no matter how long it takes. CCP play a fundamental role for stability of the financial market they serve, but for financial stability in general. The recent events have confirmed how CCP increased the resilience is key to manage market turbulence, but has also showed that there is still some room for further enhancement and improvement. That's why it's not a surprise that the CCP continue to play a central role also in the global regulatory agenda. As you know, there are 4 areas of concerning CCP resilience and recovery, where CPMI and IOSCO are currently working. These areas are auctions, non-default losses, client clearing, and margins. Before providing a brief updating on each of these work streams, I just would like to mention that there are also other areas which are not CCP specific, where CPMI and IOSCO are working, that could be any way of relevance to CCP. These areas are regulation of stablecoins, the DeFi and the use of DLT, cyber risk, and last but not least, climate change. But let's now move to CCP issues, and let's start with auctions. CPMI and IOSCO have been working on effective auction since long, because this is an area where the industry has not been able to deliver the expected results when scheduled. The reason of these delays are in part due to the pandemic, but I feel that the main reason of the delay remains the complexity of the issue at stake, and in particular the need to reconcile interest of different stakeholders. So what happens is that while something has been delivered and is continued to be delivered in the field of standardization, very little progress has been achieved on governance issues. In particular, there were 2 types of governance issues that were identified in the CPMI IOSCO report. One concerned the governance of the auction process, and the other is about the participation of the clients in bidding. Concerning the first area, there are still split views among different stakeholders concerning both the role and the composition of the risk committees and the role and the composition of the default management group. Similarly, for participation in client in clearing, there are a lot of different views concerning both the type of whether or not clients should be authorized to be direct participants, what should be the criteria to select these participants, whether or not information concerning participation of clients in bidding should be disclosed to clearing members, what could be the penalization of the disincentivation in case of a bad bidding. All these issues are controversial, and for this reason, the PSG, the Policy Standing Group, decided to convene a meeting, possibly in July, among different stakeholders to try to see better what are the reasons of disagreement, to see whether there is room for further convergence among the different stakeholders, and whether there is a need for providing additional guidance on this topic in case of a proven market failure. The second topic, as I said, is non-default losses. On this, I can be relatively brief because CPMI and IOSCO are going to release a report in the next months. And during the consultation, I'm sure there will be a lot of opportunity for us to come back and discuss the topic. At this stage, I just would like to remind why we are doing this work. Non-default losses are by definition much more difficult to predict, control, and quantify than default losses. And as a consequence, it's much more difficult to design a risk mitigation measure that address properly the implication of non-default scenario and allocating adequate resources. Moreover, despite of the fact that both the PFMI and the recovery guidance provide guidance on non-default losses, there seems to be very little common understanding of what are the CCP current practices to address non-default losses. Against this background, the CPMI IOSCO report provides an overview of current CCP practice and is intended to help advance industry effort and foster dialogue on some key concept and process used by CCP in addressing the non-default losses. And this encompasses 4 different areas. The first is developing methodologies and practice for identifying the non-default losses scenario, quantifying the related potential losses, and assess the adequacy of the resources and the tools used to address these losses. The second and the third area are respectively the need to achieve operational effectiveness of the plan to address non-default losses, and the third area, reviewing and testing these plans. And finally, last but not least, the area of providing effective governance and transparency to these measures. As I said before, we are going to launch the market consultation. During the market consultation, there will be a lot of opportunity to complement and enrich the analysis and to identify where needed possibility of additional actions, and even if needed, appropriate guidance. Though the purpose of the report was not to provide guidance on this topic, nor to assess the way CCP are implementing standards in this respect. Let's move now to client clearing. Client clearing is one area where the work of CPMI IOSCO is going to be concluded. As you may know, a report for market consultation has been launched last year, and now the group is finalizing the consultation and is finalizing the report, try to take into account the helpful feedback we have received from the consultation itself. The purpose of the report was to analyze the implication that excessive concentration of client clearing on a very few number of clearing banks may have on access and portability in particular. So the part on access focus on direct and sponsor models that have been designed by the CCP in order to allow entities that historically participated only indirectly to have direct access to CCP services. This model have introduced several benefits, but have also introduced new risks. For example, the risk of default of a sponsor member that, however, can be addressed within the current framework provided by the PFMI. More importantly, or equally importantly, these models have not been equally used in all market segments and by all potential participants. In particular, they seem to be very much used in the segment of the repo markets, but they are not used, or they are very limited use in case of derivative. Moreover, they are more used by some category of large players, but they don't seem to be used because they remain too costly by the smaller players. That means that despite their benefits, in the end, the models have failed the objective of reduced concentration. The market analysis, the market feedback has been very positive. There has been a general agreement both on the description of the models as well on the challenges, incentive and risk distribution among different kinds of participants that they would imply. The only area of disagreement is about what could be the right incentive to have a greater use of these models by more players and in more market. On the side of the industry, there was no intention to conduct further joint follow-up work on this area, but it's clear that the CCP will continue individually to conduct further work, in particular driven by issues like new clearing obligation or Basel charge requirements that are out of the scope of the mandate of CPMI IOSCO. On the side of the regulators, we also don't see at this stage a need for further work because, as I said before, there is the new aspect that have been put forward by the new model can be addressed within the current framework of the PFMI. The second part of the report was about portability. Here, the report identified a number of effective porting practice and also a number of areas for possible follow-up work. Also, this part of the report has been very well received. There has been a consensus about the effective porting practice that we're focusing in particular on alternative client clearing service provider arrangements and game plans, as well as on the area for possible follow-up work. The industry welcomed the fact that they will continue to work on important issues like transparency, coordination, communication, harmonization, and testing. Moreover, the industry insisted a lot on the fact that there are still some regulatory impediments to the achievement of effective porting practice and welcome possible follow-up work to remove these impediments. Now, the problem is that most of these impediments relate to anti-money laundering requirements or know your customer requirements or BCPS capital charges, which are all issues which are for other authorities than the CPMI and the IOSCO. And a number of other impediments have been identified at the jurisdictional level, so issues that cannot be addressed at a global level. One of these, and there has been a lot of insistence, relates to the need for client consent in some accounting practice. This issue seems to be an issue for the EU, for the European Union. So I will personally welcome a dialogue between the stakeholders that have been insisting on this point, for example, the European Association of CCP, each, and the relevant authorities, in particular European Commission and ESMA, to look how this issue could be eventually addressed. So let's move to the last topic, that is margins. Margin in this moment is the hottest topic. As you know, last year a joint group was created of CPMI, IOSCO, but also Basel Committee in order to better investigate the implication of the pandemic. This group has released a report for market consultation last December, and currently the group is going to finalize the report that hopefully will be released in the next months. Margins, as I said, are really very important and are especially important in time of crisis, as the recent events are showing. Why? Because in principle, what happens in crisis? Market turbulence increase uncertainty, uncertainty increase market volatility, and increased volatility generates additional calls for margin that have as a consequence liquidity pressures. Now, the additional calls for margin depends on a number of factors, including the responsiveness of the margins models to the emergency situation. And on the other end, the pressure on liquidity can be more complex and more difficult to manage in case of procyclicality, cumbersome procedure for the collection of variation margin, unpreparedness of the market to address this situation, and eventually not good functioning of the relevant money market where liquidity has to be found, like, for example, the repo market. That's why there is no surprise that the report identified 5 areas for follow-up work concerning respectively responsiveness of the central cleared initial margin to market stress with focus on impact and implication for the CCP resources, the responsiveness of non-centrally cleared initial margin, streamlining of the process of variation margin for both centrally and non-centrally cleared products, enhance liquidity preparedness, and increase transparency. Just one note to underline the relevance of transparency that may affect horizontally also some of the other topics I mentioned. Just to say that transparency is a topic that concerns not only margins, but need to increase transparency has been identified also in other areas. And this has been the case of client clearing, as I mentioned before. It's been the case for non-default losses, as maybe will come even more clear during the market consultation, and can be the case also for some of the dossiers that we will look at the future, like, for example, climate change. And for this reason, it is very important that already with this report on margin, the approach that has been taken by the authority has been to be as comprehensive as possible. So to look not only at the completeness, clarity, and frequency of the disclosure, but also to disclosure not only of CCP, but also of clearing members to customers where relevant, as well as the use of tools and simulators that will make much more effective the process of communicating the relevant information. Before leaving margin, just one final note to see that, as you know, this topic is becoming even more sensitive in these days because of the war, because as you know, one of the implications has been extreme volatility in the commodity derivatives, and in particular in the area of energy and derivative products that again translated into an increase for margin. There are several analyses in progress in different forums. At the European level, it seems that the problem is further complicated by the fact that it seems to be high concentration in a few clearing members and very few specialized CCP for derivatives commodities. And even more important, it seems that there has been an excessive procyclicality that could lead ESMA to take into account the need for special anti-procyclicality measure in the case of commodity markets. So as you see, we are facing a different time. We have a lot of important challenge ahead, but I'm confident that cooperation among authorities and cooperation with relevant stakeholders remains a key tool in order to properly address all this issue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muy interesante, Daniela. Muchas gracias. A continuación, intervendrá Nicoleta Justo. Nicoleta es miembro independiente del Comité de Supervisión de ECCs en ESMA. Nicoleta nos explicará en su intervención el papel de ESMA con el nuevo marco regulatorio. Esta intervención también se va a desarrollar en formato online. Nicoleta, por favor.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank first the CNMV for putting together such an interesting agenda and promoting discussion with involved stakeholders from the industry, the academia, the relevant authorities, and further the dialogue on international regulatory framework on CCP recovery and resolution. The framework on CCP recovery and resolution plays an important part in the broad post-crisis reform. While CCPs have always been important market infrastructure at the heart of the financial system, they were not taken as an essential actor for ensuring the overall stability of the financial system. CCP's performance during the worldwide financial crisis in the years 2008-2009, and particularly the ability to contain counterparty credit risk stemming from the default of market participants, played an important role in the reforms which led to the introduction of mandatory clearing for standardized over-the-counter derivatives. CCPs therefore increased their roles and their importance for the financial system, earning the qualification of systemically important entities by definition. As a consequence of the Pittsburgh G20 summit, existing international standards for CCPs were updated, consolidated, and strengthened by raising the minimum standards and providing more detailed guidance on CCP risk management practices. Based on Principles for Financial Market Infrastructure issued by CPSS IOSCO, each jurisdiction introduced a regulatory framework for CCP based on the standards that authorities should follow. Following the adoption in Europe of EMIR in 2012, the European Union has further strengthened and enhanced the resilience of CCPs by continuously adopted further amendment as necessary. The European regulatory framework, however, needed to be further enhanced to ensure the resilience of CCP and the proper address of extreme event of a failing CCP. Extreme events, here one might think of a black swan event, leading to the failure of a CCP will most probably materialize with a very low probability. One may think that CCP are fail-safe, but history teaches us otherwise. Towards the end of the last centuries, 3 CCP failures occurred. The failure of the French Caisse de Liquidation des Affaires Marchandises, the failure of the Malaysian Kuala Lumpur Commodity Clearing House, and the failure of the Hong Kong Futures Exchanges. So CCP failures have occurred in the past and can occur again. It was therefore evident when the reforms were discussed that it was necessary to establish an appropriate framework to deal with such situation and contain as much as possible their impact on the financial system and ultimately on taxpayers' money. In cases CCP is on the verge of failing or likely to fail, there are 2 options, recovery and resolution. In the widest sense, recovery refers to the measures that are to be taken in case of both member default and non-default related events to restore the financial soundness of a CCP or to allow it to continue to provide critical service. The objective of resolution is to maintain continuity of a failing CCP's critical functions while avoiding significant adverse effect on the stability of the financial system and ultimately minimizing the cost of the failure on taxpayers. In the EU, the CCP Recovery and Resolution Regulation was introduced in February 2021 following a long negotiation process. And this was necessary as indicated in view of ensuring at European level the implementation of international standards so far adopted by the relevant standard setting bodies. The regulation follows the usual format of EU regulation, envisaging alongside the so-called Level 1 framework the so-called implementing measures, providing detailed rules by developing the general principles set out in the Level 1 regulation. The Recovery and Resolution Regulation provides 19 empowerments to ESMA to develop technical standards to be submitted to the European Commission for endorsement and guidelines which are adopted directly by ESMA. Therefore, the first role of ESMA in respect to the Recovery and Resolution framework is to contribute to the rulemaking and the drafting of the European Single Rule Book. To summarize shortly, we have divided the work on the implementing measures between the recovery package and the resolution package. The recovery package contains 6-7 mandates on the CCP recovery regime, and it focused on the additional amount of pre-funded dedicated own resources, the so-called second skin in the game, which represent an important and innovative, compared to international standard, feature of the European framework. It deals with recovery plans and early intervention measures. The recovery package was delivered by ESMA on at the end of January 2021. Then ESMA started addressing the resolution mandates, which will be processed in 2 batches. The first batch of mandate included the guidelines on the application of circumstances under which a CCP is deemed to be failing or likely to fail, RTS on safeguard of client assets, on valuation of CCP's assets and liability in resolution, methodology to value each contract prior to termination. Other regulatory measures are presently under consultation, which is due to close on August 1st, and it covers additional provisions on resolution plan, colleges, international cooperation arrangement. The aim is to be able to deliver the final reports on these mandates by the end of the year. The other remaining resolution mandate will be delivered by the 12th of February 2023 as envisaged by the regulation, and they cover topics such as the minimum elements and criteria for the approval of the business reorganization plan, additional guidelines to promote convergence of certain resolution practice, and the guidelines on cooperation arrangement with their country authorities. The amount of rulemaking involved was huge, as it is evident from the summary list that I have just highlighted. And it will require an extensive effort both to national competent authorities and to CCP to be fully put in place. This particular extensive contribution to the single rule book was deemed necessary by the legislation and by ESMA in order to promote convergence in the EU, and particularly because it was necessary to address problems stemming from possible diverging provisions governing resolution processes in national legislation. A failure of a CCP could affect participants and stakeholders operating in different EU jurisdictions. Therefore, it is particularly important that the regulatory framework provides consistency and clarity on which measures need to be put in place and which instrument will be used to handle the crisis should a crisis materialize, and should ensure a common approach European-wide. ESMA stands ready to provide, if necessary, support to authorities and market participants in the implementation of the above-mentioned regulatory package. If necessary, additional instruments of convergence could be used, ranging from Q&As to opinions and other guidelines, in addition to those that were already issued. Moreover, ESMA also participates to the relevant international fora, namely IOSCO, CPSS, and FSB relevant groups, with the aim of ensuring consistency of the international standards with the European framework, also in the international debate, with the ultimate goal to achieve also at global level a level playing field for CCPs, market participants, stakeholders in general. Rulemaking and standard setting activities represent only a part of the work of ESMA in promoting and fostering convergence at European level. The single rule book needs to be implemented consistently. Fully harmonized or identical rules may still ultimately result in an unlevel playing field if they are implemented and enforced according to different national approach or with different intensity. ESMA is deeply focused in fostering the development of common supervisory practice. In this respect, ESMA anticipates that a key role in supporting such efforts will be played by the ESMA Resolution Committee to be established in accordance with the regulation by the 12th of August next. The committee will gather the resolution authorities which have to be designated by member states in accordance with the provision in Recovery and Resolution Regulation. Additional relevant national authorities and institutions will be able to attend the meetings of the Resolution Committee as observers and as appropriate. Among the key tasks of the committee, the most urgent will include the promotion of the drawing up and coordination of resolution plan, the development of methods for the resolution of failing CCP. It is also envisaged that the committee provide a forum for the exchange of information on resolution practices by national competent authorities, including in areas where no common regulation standards guideline exist yet, in order to identify the possible best resolution practice and suggest to ESMA, as the case may be, the adoption of relevant convergence tools. The committee is also to be consulted in preparation of the conceptual framework for the assessment of the resilience of CCP to adverse market developments in cases where the assessment includes the aggregate effect of CCP recovery and resolution arrangements on union financial stability. The consultation is also envisaged on the assessment of the outcome of the said exercise. The committee may also usefully assist the resolution authorities in ensuring a convergent approach on the exchange of confidential information inside the EU and with third countries' authorities. This activity with respect to third countries' authorities will be particularly important in addition to the RTS and the guidelines to ensure consistency Europe-wide vis-à-vis third countries, given that ESMA, differently from the case of EMIR, has not been entrusted by the Recovery and Resolution Regulation with power to conclude a cooperation arrangement with third countries, not even with respect the so-called third country Tier 2 CCPs. The above remarks are focused on the resolution part. However, ESMA is strongly committed to ensure convergence also on recovery matters. In this respect, it may be worth mentioning that ESMA already started in the Supervisory Committee an organized exchange of information and experiences on recovery plans that have started being submitted to the national competent authorities and to the colleges. According to the regulation, resolution plans, in fact, have to be submitted to EMIR colleges, which are colleges established under EMIR, and not to the resolution colleges to be established under the recovery and resolution regime. The exchange of views on the implementation of the provisions on recovery plans, even if the RTS have not yet been endorsed by the European Commission, and the assessment performed by the national competent authorities. At the very moment in which a new set of regulations starts being applied, is key in our view to foster consistency and promote convergence. For once, we can try to promote consistent supervisory practice at the moment in which the regulation become operative. The regulation also expressly foresee another role for ESMA, the role of mediator, even if so far we didn't have cases under other pieces of regulation which provide for mediation role, we cannot rule out, particularly due to the relevance of the issues dealt by in the Recovery and Resolution regulation, that may have to mediate in the future. Competent authority under such provisions may request ESMA's intervention in the event of disagreement between the different members of a resolution college on decision to be taken regarding a CCP's resolution plan, the assessment of a CCP's resolvability, and the decision to remove any impediment thereto. Such mediation by ESMA should be prepared for consideration by an ESMA committee. In view of the competence of ESMA members to ensure financial stability and to oversee clearing members in several member states, it is anticipated that such ESMA decision in relation to mediation under Recovery and Resolution regulation should be prepared by the CCP Resolution Committee, which will play a very important role in this respect. The Recovery and Resolution regulation complements further the role of ESMA as pivotal in assessing risks to investors, to markets, and to financial stability. ESMA may use its unique position in relation to the CCPs, which are crucial infrastructure, whether in business as usual condition or in difficult times, to identify market developments that may threaten financial stability, investor protection, or the orderly functioning of financial markets. In addition to the European-wide stress test envisaged under EMIR, the Resolution Committee will be consulted, as already indicated above, in cases of assessment of the resilience of CCP to adverse market development, when this assessment will include the aggregate effect of the CCP Recovery and Resolution arrangement on the Union financial stability. Concluding, the ESMA roles in the new framework should enable it to promote a consistent and effective implementation application of same rules and to achieve comparable supervisory outcome in the context of the EU-wide CCP Recovery and Resolution framework. Through its activities, ESMA should be able to develop a holistic view across the recovery and resolution activities of the competent authorities, enabling ESMA to communicate and support the national competent authorities and the market infrastructure as necessary. As we have recently experienced, unforeseen events may materialize without warning at any time and have the potential to profoundly impact the resilience of the financial markets and their participants. The involved and competent authority needs to stand ready to react and accompany the CCP falling under their supervision in the journey and in the situation that we hope unlikely but not impossible, that a crisis leading to recovery or resolution of a CCP should materialize. ESMA, to its role and its capability to leverage on the already existing EMIR framework, as indicated, stands ready to support national competent authorities in their work, and in particular in case of potential failure. I thank you for your attention and look forward to meeting you in person in the near future.
Muchas gracias, Nicoleta. Para terminar, tenemos la suerte de contar con la presencia de Ana Puente. Ana es subdirectora general de Legislación del Mercado de Valores e Instrumentos Financieros en la Secretaría General del Tesoro. Ana nos ofrecerá una visión general sobre el Reglamento de Recuperación y Resolución de Cámaras. Ana, por favor.
Buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias. Quería empezar agradeciendo a la Comisión Nacional del Mercado de Valores la oportunidad de poder intervenir en esta jornada hoy con ustedes. Yo quería compartir a lo largo de esta exposición algunas reflexiones sobre los elementos principales del reglamento de nivel 1. Intentaré abarcar en la medida de lo posible las diferentes etapas en la recuperación y la resolución de las cámaras de contrapartida central, con la idea de poder resaltar cuáles son sus elementos fundamentales, cuáles son aquellas herramientas, aquellas características que nos llevó más tiempo a negociar, aquellos elementos que bloquearon en un momento dado las negociaciones y, lo que es más importante, los acuerdos que nos permitieron finalmente avanzar y lograr un acuerdo político y el texto que hoy tenemos para mejorar sin duda la estabilidad financiera de los mercados europeos. La propuesta inicial de la Comisión Europea fue publicada en el año 2016 y el acuerdo político no se alcanzó hasta finales del 2020. La negociación no estuvo exenta de dificultades, la tramitación fue relativamente larga, pero sí me gustaría resaltar un poco, rescatar la nota de prensa que a finales del 2020 la presidencia de turno del Consejo, en aquel momento la presidencia croata, publicó, ¿no?, donde señalaba que el escenario de volatilidad e incertidumbre de los mercados en aquel momento hacía especialmente oportuno el haber alcanzado un acuerdo político para el marco de recuperación y resolución de cámaras de contrapartida central. Sin duda, estas reflexiones están de plena actualidad. Lo mismo podemos pensar hoy día con la vista puesta en la efectiva implementación y entrada en vigor del reglamento. Me voy a detener muy poquito en los objetivos que persigue el reglamento, son de sobra conocidos. Se trata de ofrecer herramientas a las autoridades competentes para poder enfrentar y acometer lo mejor posible posibles dificultades financieras de las cámaras. En primer lugar, se trata de reducir al máximo posible las posibilidades de dificultades, crear los incentivos adecuados para que la gestión del riesgo sea lo más adecuada posible, tanto por parte de la Cámara como por parte de sus miembros compensadores. Y, en segundo lugar, por supuesto, los objetivos son minimizar el impacto en la estabilidad financiera, preservar las funciones esenciales de la Cámara y, por supuesto, minimizar también el impacto para el contribuyente de un posible escenario de resolución, efectivamente. Estos objetivos, el de preservar la estabilidad financiera, preservar las funciones esenciales de estas entidades, nos suenan a todos, son comunes, aparecen en el marco de resolución de entidades de crédito. Sin duda, los principios que rigen el reglamento de recuperación y resolución de cámaras de contrapartida central están basados y son un espejo que reflejan la resolución bancaria. Durante toda la negociación, cada vez que estudiábamos algún elemento, alguna herramienta, primero mirábamos cómo se estaba aplicando en banca para ver luego cómo se podía aplicar en las cámaras, si tenía sentido o no. Estas similitudes estaban muy presentes. Pero también estaban muy presentes las diferencias. La relación jurídico-financiera, se me permiten, entre una entidad de crédito, sus accionistas, sus acreedores y sus depositantes, no es lo mismo que la relación jurídico-financiera que existe entre la entidad de contrapartida central, sus miembros compensadores, sus clientes, en función de sus tipos de clientes. Hay algunas diferencias que también tuvimos que tener muy en cuenta y que sin duda presiden también la aplicación efectiva del reglamento. Un último apunte de esta primera parte un poco introductoria es los intervinientes, las autoridades públicas intervinientes en la recuperación y resolución de cámaras de contrapartida central. Sin duda también yo creo que es un elemento característico de esta pieza normativa. Contamos por una parte con la autoridad competente designada conforme al reglamento EMIR, que tiene un papel importantísimo en la aplicación de este reglamento. Tenemos la autoridad de resolución, igual que en el ámbito bancario hay una autoridad de resolución, y tenemos la figura de los colegios de supervisores y los colegios de supervisión. Hay que tener en cuenta que conseguir el objetivo de preservar la estabilidad financiera en todas las distintas etapas de intervención que contempla el Reglamento Europeo no puede conseguirse únicamente mirando la propia infraestructura, la Cámara, dónde está situada, la jurisdicción en la que está o cómo es el ecosistema financiero estrictamente la jurisdicción en la que está. El impacto en los miembros compensadores es fundamental, el contagio que pueda haber es fundamental. También sucede en los bancos, efectivamente, pero este es un aspecto crítico, ¿no? La incorporación, además de los bancos centrales recientemente en las estructuras de supervisión, pues también condiciona, también es característico de todo este marco de autoridades, ¿no? Uno de los retos de la elaboración del reglamento era sin duda dar cabida a todas estas diferentes perspectivas de supervisión y vigilancia, pero conseguir en la medida de lo posible, unas entidades eficaces a la hora de tomar decisiones, ¿no? Con unos sistemas de información y mayorías suficientemente operativos. Bien, pues tras estas consideraciones un poco introductorias, pues vamos a repasar siquiera por encima las fases que prevé el reglamento. En primer lugar, la planificación para la recuperación y la resolución de las cámaras. La entidad de contrapartida central está obligada a elaborar unos planes de recuperación, tiene que abordar todo tipo de riesgos y tiene específicamente que abordar déficits de liquidez no cubiertos, ¿no? Seguiré en la medida de lo posible la terminología en español del reglamento, aunque en ocasiones nos pueda resultar incluso un poco extraña, ¿no? Y no duden que en ocasiones se me puede escapar sin duda la denominación en inglés con la que probablemente todos podamos estar incluso más cómodos. Los planes de recuperación de la Cámara, de la entidad de contrapartida central, tienen que ser evaluados por la autoridad de supervisión designada conforme a MIR, tienen que llevarse al colegio y también tienen que evaluarse por la autoridad de resolución, con el objetivo fundamental de poder identificar posibles obstáculos o posibles impedimentos a una eventual futura resolución, posibles problemas de resolubilidad de la Cámara. Los planes de recuperación tienen que contener medidas tanto para los casos de incumplimiento como los casos de no incumplimiento. En cuanto a los casos de incumplimiento, restituir el libro de posiciones casado, digamos, asignar las pérdidas adecuadamente entre miembros compensadores, sus clientes en función de la relación que tengan con la Cámara o no, y finalmente los accionistas. Para los casos de no incumplimiento, los planes de recuperación deben incluir mecanismos de absorción de pérdidas adecuados. Entre estos mecanismos pues, ya conocemos los más clásicos o los más debatidos o los más conocidos, al menos por los reguladores, ¿no? La solicitud de fondos adicionales para los miembros compensadores no incumplidores, reducción del valor de las garantías aportadas para el margen de variación o un acceso a los recursos propios de la Cámara. Los planes de recuperación tienen que incluir indicadores para poder determinar cuándo debe activarse ese plan de recuperación o no. Es muy interesante también señalar cómo el reglamento interno de la entidad de contrapartida central debe contemplar los casos en los que, aun no incurriéndose en estos indicadores, se pueden aplicar medidas de los planes de recuperación y al revés, ¿no? Cuando incurriendo en los indicadores, sucediendo esos indicadores, se considera que no es adecuado, podría no ser adecuado aplicar el plan de recuperación. La autoridad competente, conforme al reglamento de MIR, debe estar informada de todo esto y de aquellos casos en los que la Cámara decide aplicar el plan de recuperación. La segunda pieza, la segunda herramienta de planificación es el propio plan de resolución que debe elaborar la autoridad de resolución para pues poder gestionar adecuadamente cualquier dificultad financiera. Para ello se debe tener en cuenta la inviabilidad de la Cámara derivada de situación de incumplimiento y de no incumplimiento o de una combinación de ambas y el efecto que la aplicación de las medidas de resolución puede tener en los miembros compensadores, en los clientes, en cualquier otra infraestructura, en los centros de negociación a las que pueda dar servicio esa Cámara y, en definitiva, al sistema financiero en su conjunto. Hay que destacar, el reglamento dedica un artículo al concepto de resolubilidad, ¿no? Cuándo se dan las condiciones para poder estar en resolución, poder aplicar la resolución, ¿no? Cuando el procedimiento de resolución y la aplicación de esas medidas garantiza la continuidad de las funciones esenciales, evita recursos a ayudas financieras extraordinarias no hay posibilidad de que las partes afectadas se vean injustamente desfavorecidas. Esa es un poco la terminología que utiliza el reglamento para poder evaluar esa condición de resolubilidad, ¿no? Cuando puede llevarse a cabo la resolución. También deben identificarse obstáculos a la resolubilidad y por supuesto, pues, mitigarse o eliminarse, ¿no? Toda esta primera fase es la de planificación. La segunda fase son las medidas de actuación temprana. La autoridad competente de la supervisión de la Cámara, conforme a MIR, puede activar, digamos, las medidas contenidas en el plan de recuperación. Puede también instar cambios en su estructura, cambios en el Consejo de Administración, etc. Hay un elemento aquí muy importante, o al menos muy debatido y que se negoció con muchísimo cuidado, que es lo relativo a la posibilidad de que la autoridad competente obligue a la Cámara a ofrecer compensaciones a los miembros compensadores no incumplidores, ¿no? Las condiciones en las que se ofrece esta compensación, cuándo, cómo, insisto, fue largamente debatido, ¿no? No sé si recuerdan el artículo, unas frases larguísimas, muchas subordinadas, etcétera, etcétera. Pero es verdad que es un elemento clave quizá para garantizar, como decía al principio, esa disciplina y esa gestión adecuada de los riesgos, ¿no? Lo que uno puede esperar en función de la gestión del riesgo que haga pues es especialmente importante y esta parte del reglamento fue largamente debatida, negociada y hasta alcanzar un poco el equilibrio que conocemos. La tercera y última etapa del proceso es propiamente la fase de resolución. El reglamento establece los principios de la resolución, de nuevo muy inspirados en la resolución bancaria, cumplimiento de obligaciones contractuales o exención del cumplimiento de determinadas obligaciones contractuales, la asunción de pérdidas por accionistas, por acreedores, trato igualitario de los acreedores. Y a continuación aparece también otro principio clave y básico de la resolución, ¿no? Los accionistas, los miembros compensadores o otros acreedores no podrán soportar en la resolución pérdidas mayores de las que hubieran soportado con una liquidación concursal ordinaria de la entidad. De nuevo, este fue otro elemento enormemente discutido, largamente debatido, donde prácticamente cada coma importaba, ¿no? Yo creo que con mejor o peor fortuna, pero en aquel momento éramos muy conscientes de que una deficiente configuración de este principio podría desembocar en una judicialización de los procedimientos de resolución, ¿no? De tanto las decisiones que hubiera tomado la Cámara, las decisiones que hubiera tomado cualquier autoridad involucrada en todo el procedimiento, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, pues también es otro elemento clave para el funcionamiento del reglamento. También en esta fase de resolución el reglamento presta mucha importancia a la valoración de los activos, también lo ha señalado la ponente que me ha precedido, y por último los instrumentos de resolución. No me voy a detener en todos ellos, se alargaría esto demasiado, quizá no tiene mucho interés, únicamente señalaré de nuevo aquellos que se debatieron más, ¿no? Aquellos sobre los que tuvimos que trabajar más. En primer lugar, los Resolution Cash Calls, ¿no? Esas llamadas al capital, esas llamadas a fondos adicionales por parte de los mismos compensadores en esta fase de resolución, ¿no? Se discutía mucho si el reglamento debía poner un límite a esa posible llamada de fondos, cuál debía ser ese límite. Teníamos cuidado porque en el contrafactual concursal no teníamos este tipo de instrumentos, cómo iba a jugar, bueno, hubo que dedicarle ahí bastante tiempo. Esto además, sobre todo en la fase de trílogos, se combinaba bastante esta negociación o este estudio, este análisis con la exigencia del segundo requerimiento de capital a la Cámara, su carácter o no prefinanciado. Ahí estuvimos bastantes semanas trabajando sobre ello. También el hecho de si las herramientas de resolución debían ser una lista abierta o cerrada, cada Estado miembro tenía sus preferencias, sus exclusiones claras, sus inclusiones claras, etcétera, etcétera. No quiero concluir sin hacer referencia también a la intervención de los gobiernos, ¿no? A cómo el reglamento de recuperación y resolución de cámaras de contrapartida central prevé pues digamos que la ayuda pública, la ayuda financiera como último recurso para poder solucionar eventuales dificultades de la Cámara de Contrapartida Central. Este fue, sin duda, y digamos, analizando toda la negociación desde el 2016 hasta el 2020, el elemento más controvertido de todos, ¿no? Y de hecho paralizó, bloqueó, aparcó, llamémoslo como queramos, la negociación durante bastante tiempo. Era difícil configurar en una norma de nivel 1 vinculante para todos los Estados miembros cómo iban a, digamos, vincularse recursos públicos al corazón de la soberanía nacional de cada Estado, ¿no? Entonces era un tema bastante peliagudo de resolver. ¿Cómo se consiguió, digamos, desbloquear esto, ¿no? Pues yo creo que principalmente mediante dos vías, ¿no? En primer lugar, de forma un poco machacona, si me permiten la expresión, el reglamento incluye permanentemente que la aprobación de un plan de recuperación, un plan de resolución, la activación de cualquiera de sus herramientas no supone como tal necesariamente la utilización de ayuda pública financiera extraordinaria, ni necesariamente ayuda en forma de provisión urgente de liquidez del Banco Central, ni este tipo de ayuda en condiciones no convencionales, ¿no? En cuanto a garantías, vencimientos, etcétera. Esto un poco daba bastante confort, ¿no? En primer lugar, pues para poder manejar adecuadamente el riesgo moral asociado a cualquier marco de ayuda pública, por así decirlo, y bueno, y el hecho de que, insisto, está permanentemente, ¿no? No hay duda de que es un último recurso. Y la segunda vía pues ya fue la redacción concreta de los artículos donde aparecen las herramientas, los instrumentos públicos de estabilización, los de apoyo al capital o los de la titularidad pública temporal. And now please let me change into English just for brief 5 minutes in attention to our international audience here attending the meeting today. And I will just sum up very briefly what I've explained before. I would like to highlight the importance of the regulation. It took 5 years to negotiate the regulation and to reach an agreement between the European Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament. I highlighted that the press release that was launched at the end of the negotiation stressed the idea of the volatility and the uncertainty of markets in that moment, the end of 2020, and how this is completely applicable today. And this is the same that we have now when we are facing the entry into force of the regulation. The objectives is to provide the competent authorities with the appropriate tools to address financial difficulties of CCPs, to reduce the possibility of having these difficulties, and to establish the right incentives for the best risk management of the CCP and their clearing members. Another objective is, of course, to manage crises, preserving financial stability, preserving the main functions of the CCP, and also to minimize costs for taxpayers. We must take into account the similarities between banking resolution and CCP resolution. There are many principles and many tools and many approaches that are similar, and we can learn from each other, but we must always take into account differences. The legal and financial relation between credit entities, their shareholders, and their deposits, the citizens, and how CCPs are dealing with their clearing members and clients is not exactly the same, and we must take that into account when interpreting the regulation and applying it. I also highlighted the specificities of competent authorities dealing with level 1 regulation. We have competent authorities designed under EMIR regulation. We also have resolution authorities, and we have policies of resolution, and also governments. They also play a role or they may play a role in the application of the level 1 regulation. And finally, I went through the different phases of the recovery and resolution, the planning of recovery and resolution with recovery plans, the evaluation that the competent authorities must do on these plans, and how must they be applied by the CCP. The second phase of early intervention, and how the competent authority may apply the tools included in the recovery plan, and the possibility of imposing the CCP to offer compensation to those clearing members that were not default members, and the importance of this offer of compensation in order to put the right incentives in the level 1 regulation. And finally, we have the resolution phase, in order to manage the situations when the financial difficulties are higher than the resources available in the CCP, and what elements must take into account this resolution phase, and the principles guiding the application of resolution tools. One of these main principles is the no creditor worse-off, very difficult to negotiate, to design, and to debate within the negotiations of the level 1 regulation. And the level 1 regulation also established specific rules for valuation in the resolution phase, and also the instruments. I didn't went instruments by instrument, but I highlighted resolution cash calls and the debates we had regarding the cap, or regarding the fact that we don't have resolution cash calls in, let's say, ordinary insolvency proceedings, and also other debates we had regarding the open or closed list of resolution tools. My final remarks were about the possible use of public resources in the recovery and resolution, in the resolution of CCPs, and how this was a really controversial issue in the negotiation, and how we managed to include several provisions in the Level 1 regulation in order to reduce, let's say, moral hazard associated with this kind of regulations, and to give somehow confidence and well, yes, confidence enough to public authorities to establish that, yes, only the public resources will be the last resource in a resolution situation. Okay, this is all from my side. Thank you so much. Thank you to the CNMV, and bye.
Pues nada, una vez finalizada la primera parte del evento, vamos a hacer un pequeño descanso. Si lo deseamos, podemos tomar un café en el hall que está aquí saliendo del salón. Y como llevamos 10 minutos de retraso, pues la vuelta será a las 11:20, si les parece. Muchas gracias.
Well, okay. Thank you very much all for coming to this conference. We are going to dedicate this panel to comment on one of the aspects on which more work is being done in recent times regarding the recovery and resolution of CCPs, which is basically the way in which operational losses are identified and managed by CCPs, in particular in the context of the recovery phase. And generally speaking, those losses are basically losses that are not being caused by the default of any participant. We have the advantage of having a speaker with a lot of experience in clearing and security markets in general, who also come from different backgrounds. So I hope that they can provide us with with a lot of insight in this issue. First of all, I would like to introduce to Patricia Doncel, who is the Chief Compliance Officer at BMI Clearing, and therefore has first-hand knowledge of how CCPs are preparing to comply with the European regulation of recovery and resolution of CCPs, and in particular with regard to the treatment of non-default losses. Patricia has been also responsible for operations and quality of BMI Innova, that now is BMI Tech, which is a company of BMI which was dedicated, among other issues, to business continuity aspects of different companies and suspicions, transaction reporting, and other operational matters. So that has helped her to have a certain passion for all these issues relating to operational risk management. Secondly, we have to Natalia da Gama. Natalia da Gama works at Banco Santander, where, among other things, she is in charge of the interest rate interbank execution desk, the risk management of interest rates CCP clearing, the management of CCP's margin optimization, and she has been deeply involved in several regulatory changes, such as the Dodd-Frank Act, EMIR, MiFID II, Basel III, CDR4, and so on. And thirdly, we have the presence of Rafael Plata. Rafael Plata is the Secretary General of Fitch, which is the European Association of Clearing Houses, and because of that, Rafael has a great experience in reviewing all regulatory initiatives that have been developed in the field of CCPs and clearing in general in recent times. So thank you very much for coming here, Rafael. And last but not least, we have, I would like to introduce to Pablo Iglesias Rodriguez. Pablo is a senior lecturer in international finance law at Sussex Law School, where he combines the LLM in financial law. He is also a member of the consultative working group of the CCP Policy Committee of the European Securities and Market Regulation, ESMA, and currently he is visiting a scholar at Max Planck Institute for Comparative and International Private Law. So again, thank you very much also for you for being here. And well, as I pointed out before, one of the issues of greatest interest in the last few years is basically the treatment of the losses that do not arise from the default of a clearing member, of a CCP participant. It is important also to point out that the CCPs are entities that basically interpose themselves between the buyer and the seller. So if one of the parties to that particular contract fails, the CCP replaces it. So in other words, the CCP is typically an entity whose main function is basically to manage counterparty risk of the financial transaction in the security market, just to, in a very organized manner and in a predictable manner. So, and that basically makes that the management of counterparty risk is widely known. I mean, we all know what are the requirements that the CCP must meet in that context. The participants also know what is the default waterfall, what are the rules that are going to be applied in that case, and so on. But in the context of the non-default losses, the issue is different. I mean, so when authorities and regulators and in general started to discuss how non-default losses should be treated, we found different issues that raise our attention. For example, first, because when trying to identify the scenarios that could lead to a CCP, the default of a CCP, or the CCP getting into trouble, financial trouble, serious trouble because of any issue, we understand that not only the main activities of the CCP could be relevant, but also other activities of the CCP, such as, for example, the investment losses that the CCP could face, the operational losses, cyber security events that could also pose different risks to the CCP, were particularly relevant in those cases, and in general could threaten the stability and the well-functioning of the CCP. Second, because when we analyze all those aspects, we found that it was very heterogeneous, the ways in which the CCPs were managing those risks. And also we found that there were an absence of data and reference on operational loss event, in particular when those loss events were relevant to threaten the stability of the CCP. So to make a proper assessment of all those aspects were a challenge by itself. And third, we also found out that there were unclear issues that need to be clarified in the context of the development of the recovery plans of the CCPs in that event. So questions such as what are the incentives that the different tools that the CCP may apply to cover non-default losses were particularly relevant in that context. So that's because all those challenges, the standard setters such as CPMI IOSCO or the FSB have been working hard in this context, and as Daniela Russo has said at the beginning of this conference, there is a document where all these aspects will be discussed in the near future and will be published in the near future. Also, the European regulation impose certain requirements for the proper treatment of non-default losses in the context of the European regulation of the recovery plans. So, therefore, and with any further preamble, I would like, I could pass the floor to the speaker, and I would ask them a number of questions that may help us to shed more light on this. So I will start with Pablo. So thank you very much again, Pablo, for coming here. So could you please comment on what is the real relevance of operational risk for CCPs that could put the resilience in question? Are there issues that you are concerned about in relation to what has been developed by the European regulatory, the European Recovery and Resolution Regulation, and in particular in the treatment of operational risks and non-default losses? Is there any reason to be critical? Do you think that there are issues to be improved in that regulation, or in that regulatory framework?
Thank you very much, Miguel Angel. Thank you very much for your questions, your kind introduction, and thanks very much to the CNMV for the kind invitation to this great event. So when it comes to the questions that you have asked, in my view there is substantial evidence about the growing threat that operational risks pose to the resilience of CCPs and CC clearing more generally, and also about the fact that CCPs, or at least a number of them, may not be in the best position to address those risks. I just want to briefly mention a few documents which might be relevant in this respect. One is regarding operational risks. The report of the European Systemic Risk Board, published in February 2020, on cybersecurity threats. Also, I think it's very interesting, the joint cybersecurity advisory published by the authorities, cybersecurity authorities of the UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand in April 2022 regarding Russian state-sponsored and criminal cyber attacks on critical infrastructures. And this report suggests that after Russia's unlawful and unprovoked attack and invasion of Ukraine, these threats on critical infrastructures are going to increase, or are very likely to increase. Now, when it comes to the position of CCPs in relation to operational risks, I think that a recent report, which is relevant, is a joint report of the FSB, CPMI, and IOSCO of March 2022, which assess a number of, not a number, 7 CCPs. And one of the tests that they made in this report tested a relatively soft cybersecurity threat. It was a scenario of a cyber theft applied to all the CCPs, and according to the report, 5 out of 7 of the CCPs would not be able to withstand that, again, relatively soft cyber theft scenario, and they would need to enter into resolution. Now, in order to understand the limitations of the regulatory regime in addressing risk in general for CCPs, and more particularly the limitations of the recovery regime embedded in Regulation 2021-23 in addressing operational risks, I think that there is a key concept to analyze, and that is the concept of plausibility. European Union laws and regulations in the field of central counterparty clearing generally require that when CCPs develop instruments of risk mitigation, or generally speaking, instruments to address risk, I'm thinking here of the default fund, of pre-funded on resources, and so on, they take in consideration what may happen under extreme but plausible scenarios, extreme but plausible situations. Also, Recital 18 of the Recovery and Resolution Regulation requires that when planning recovery plan scenarios, CCPs look into what may happen under severe and but plausible situations. So the concept of plausibility largely determines the scope, the extent and scope of the regulatory measures that will be put in place to address operational risks. Now, we have a problem because neither EU law on central counterparty clearing nor administrative rules in this area actually define what plausible means. The closest thing would be the Commission Delegated Regulation 153/2013, but this delegated regulation basically provides some guidance on how to determine how to identify extreme but plausible situations in the context of central counterparty clearing. So we are basically left with the dictionary definition of the term, and there is not a single definition on this, but one which tends to be generally accepted is one that defines plausible as something that is seemingly reasonable and probable. Now, what reasonable and probable means is highly subjective. So, for example, if I were to ask the audience now whether you think it is reasonable and probable that there is a simultaneous cyber attack on 2 CCPs in 2 different member states with a let's say, a recovery time of 1 or 2 hours under current conditions, maybe most people in the audience would think that, okay, this is something maybe fairly reasonable and probable, plausible in these terms. Now, if I were to ask the audience whether they think it is reasonable and probable that there is an electromagnetic pulse attack targeted to some critical infrastructures, or more generally to 2 or 3 member states, an electromagnetic pulse attack that knocks down all the CCPs in 1 or 2 member states and more than half of the clearing members, my guess is that many people would not deem this as something particularly reasonable and probable, although I may not necessarily agree with that. That is just a guess, though. So, in policy terms, when it comes to policy making, the standard of plausibility that is used has major implications, both for the resilience of CCPs to deal with operational risk, non-default events, but also for the financial industry and for CCPs themselves. If the threshold of plausibility is one which is too low or too lenient, not particularly strict, we may end up with a regulatory regime which addresses the resilience of CCPs and financial stability in not a particularly sound way, but which may be more cost-effective for CCPs and the industry in general. If we adopt a threshold of plausibility which is too strict, well, that would not be so good for the industry, particularly for the CCP industry, in terms of cost effectiveness, but that may be better in terms of guaranteeing the resilience against operational risk and more generally financial stability. So I think that linked to this, a relevant question is what threshold, what standard of plausibility underlies the recovery and resolution regime of Regulation 2021-23. And looking at it, in my opinion, this is not a particularly high threshold of plausibility, not one that may be particularly useful to guarantee the resilience of CCPs in relation to operational risk. And I will give 2 or 3 reasons why I think that is the case. So first of all, the Recovery and Resolution Regulation makes little reference to operational risks. There are only a few references to it. And when it comes to non-default events, in my opinion, the regulation tends to focus on non-default events which lead to monetary losses, rather than on non-default events which do not cause an immediate financial or economic harm, but which in my view are a serious cause of concern. Also, if you look, for example, to ESMA's guidelines on recovery plan scenarios, they seem to treat default and non-default risk in an asymmetric way, in the sense that for default risk, they seem to embrace the requirement of the regulation, that is that CCPs must consider scenarios which are more severe than those used for regular stress testing, but for non-default events, ESMA does not seem to apply such criteria. And more generally, I think that the regime of regulation, of the Recovery and Resolution Regulation and of ESMA's regulatory actions is one that delegates, to a great extent, largely delegates the definition of what is plausible to CCPs themselves. And in my opinion, this may not be the best way to proceed from a regulatory standpoint for 2 reasons. Of course, I understand that CCPs are a key stakeholder in the discussion, and that not all CCPs are the same. CCPs are different, they are also exposed to different types of operational risk, and they should certainly have a say in the regime. But in my view, giving large amounts of discretion to CCPs to define this is not the best way for 2 reasons. First of all, because CCPs may not have the best incentive to implement a standard of a threshold of plausibility which is too strict, because that would of course lead to higher costs for CCPs. And the second is that such a regime may in the end lead to scenarios of regulatory arbitrage, which in my opinion is not a particularly good scenario. So this leads me to another reflection, which is the fact that the regime encompassed by the Recovery and Resolution regulation is one that reflects this tension between the objectives that I mentioned before. So on the one hand, you have the resilience of CCPs, guaranteeing financial stability. On the other hand, you have the objective of creating a regime which is cost-effective for CCPs. Now, in the context of recovery and resolution, particularly recovery, and more particularly with reference to operational risks, I think that there is, in a way, an inherent trade-off between these two objectives, a negative correlation, in the sense that it is highly difficult to increase one without hindering the other. And in my opinion, the issues that I mentioned before on the regulation and ESMA's actions reflect a system where the legislator and the regulator have accommodated industry needs, preferences and demands in a way which, in my opinion, may not be the best to foster the resilience of CCPs in relation to operational risks. So, how to deal with this from a policy regulatory perspective? Well, first of all, I think that the question for the regulator and the legislator should not be so much how to find a balance between the objectives, how to deal with this trade-off. I think legislators and regulators should focus primarily on how to deal with risks. In this case, with how to deal with operational risk. And if we talk of cost effectiveness, I think the focus of regulators and legislators should be how to design a system which is cost effective for society at large. Now, to conclude with my answer to this question, from a more practical standpoint, what I think should be or could be useful in terms of regulatory reform, well, that would be a system where the regulation is amended so as to include a clear mandate to ESMA to develop, either through guidelines or standards, a baseline of what is or what should be deemed as extreme but plausible in the context of operational risk and resilience against operational events. A baseline to be adopted compulsorily by all CCPs. And of course, with some freedoms and discretion, but a baseline, and one which is strict, that is, one that embraces a notion of plausibility, which comprises events which may seem today to us remotely plausible, but that in my opinion may not be so remotely plausible. Would this mean higher cost for CCPs and for clearing members? Well, that is likely the case, but in my opinion, when we talk of operational risks, non-default events in relation to CCPs, we are in uncharted waters, and the wise thing to do is to, sure, expect the best, hope the best, but prepare for the worst.
Okay, thank you very much, Pablo. I think that your contribution is very valuable. I tend to think also, I tend to agree that there is always the problem of finding the right balance between the cost that impose the application of certain regulations and what is the most efficient way to address a particular risk. I tend to think that from the supervisory aspect of all these issues, we are, as an authority in a learning process, learning each other, in particular in the context of ESMA. And I tend to think that at some point in the future, what you have already said, that there should be some more guidance on how to assess how CCPs are addressing problems relating to to non-default losses in the context of recovery plan would be fine. I tend to think I certainly agree with your considerations in some aspects. And again, I mean, there is always the problem of finding the right balance between the cost and the benefits of a particular regulatory measure. So Patricia, I would like to also some questions here. Patricia, who comes from SCCP and could give us the CCP perspective, in particular of what Pablo has already said about how the regulation is addressing all these questions. What do you think that are the challenges that the CCPs have faced in the recent times, and in particular, BMI clearing, in terms of operational risk management?
Thank you very much, Miguel Ángel, and thank you, Pablo, for your very interesting contribution. And I also wanted to thank the CNMV for organizing these conferences and for inviting BMI clearing. I think that the answer is clear now. The main challenges that we've been through lately have been mainly the pandemic situation. In the end of February 2020, we had to send all the employees home. This was something that was unexpected. In BMI clearing, we did it before the official lockdown, and so at the first stage, we had to move quickly so that all our employees could work from home. We had to achieve all the laptops, mobiles. So we had to deal with these technical things. We had to enhance all the networks, and we had to get ready very, very quickly so that we could still provide our services. And at the same time, we were experiencing a high volatility, as you know, high volatility situation. And I think that it was proof that the CCPs were resilient and that we coped with it, and the systems worked out fine. And so we were flexible, and we were changing perhaps some controls, and everything was okay. And I think that in those moments, the cooperation, both with the authorities and also between the CCPs, and here I think that each played a very important role in those moments. That was very important, you know, to have that cooperation and that communication, both with the supervisor and also with other CCPs. And also, I think it was very important that we have a very robust regulatory framework. And so here, well, for the CCPs, you know, I would like to stress, you know, the previous stage before a situation of recovery or even resolution. I think that we have, you know, through the EMIR and all the delegated regulations, and also with the CPMI IOSCO guidelines, with the ESMA regulations, with the FSB. So we are working a lot on operational risks. We of course we are focused on the counterparty risks, but the operational risks are very important as well for CCPs as for any other FMI. So that's been a very important challenge. And then after that, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would also consider that an operational risk. It of course worsened a lot the energy crisis, and we also had to deal with, and we are dealing already, I mean, still with the high volatility and prices changes, and we have also adapted to that. But then, besides that, we have experienced an increase in cyber attacks. And more importantly, we have seen that the type of cyber attacks has changed in the sense. We have been, these attacks that are related to the invasion are more focused on sabotaging the system, the financial system, and they are not so focused on getting money from the institutions. And this is something that we have experienced. And again, the cooperation with other institutions and with other FMIs has been crucial, and the communication with the authorities. So for me, these two events, important events, have been really a challenge. And again, I think that we have a regulatory framework that makes that the CCPs are well prepared for this, and that are well prepared for preventing reaching a situation of recovery.
Okay, thank you very much. But what do you think that the main difference? Because I mean, operational risk is something that CCPs are already mitigating through the normal requirements, those requirements that in the context of the EU are addressed by the MIR. What do you think that are the difference between addressing operational risk in the context of the normal functioning of a CCP and what could be handling with all those non-default losses that could be most severe and should be subject to some type of regular recovery plans? I mean, what do you think that it could be the difference between all those, the normal case and the case in which the non-default losses is more severe?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, we've been now with the pandemic situation. For instance, we've been working in a contingency situation, and we could be on a business as usual situation, being in contingency with all the fire drills, the stress test of ESMA, and so on. So in normal circumstances, business continuity is very important, and it is highly regulated in the current framework in a normal situation. And there's also in EMIR, we have all the IT resilience, we have to do tests on our systems, and so this is in business as usual, in a business as usual situation. In recovery, what would we have to do, or which scenarios we should think about? This is a difficult question. As Pablo mentioned, it's difficult to see what's plausible, but unlikely. We are now, for us, probably the cyber attacks would be a massive cyber attack would be probably the scenario that we would have to deal with. And also we are concerned about the links that we have with other FMIs or with critical providers, but still we also rely on their own recovery plans and on their own business continuity plans that we of course take into account also when we are, for our business.
Yeah. I know. Well, thank you very much, Patricia. I will come to you later, okay. But now I would like to pass the floor to Rafael. Rafael, how does your association assess the European regulatory framework for dealing with non-default losses? I think that you are have very well knowledge about how this regulation has been negotiated during the 5 years that Treasury has stated this morning.
Okay, thanks, Miguel Angel, and thank you for the CNMV for inviting me. Thanks, Maria Jose. To answer your question, could I ask a question to the audience first? Could I ask those, please, to raise your hands, those of you that think that non-default risks are today more important than default risks for CCPs? No hands? There was a shy hand there. Okay, could I ask the opposite question? Could you please raise your hands, those of you in the audience that think that default risks are today more important than non-default risks for CCPs? All right. And I'm guessing the rest you have like probably no answer or no opinion, which is fine, or probably wonder why on earth are you asking that, Rafael? So that's interesting because we, to your point, Miguel Angel, I think the regulation is quite good. It is quite adequate for CCPs, but I think it's interesting to hear from the audience that operational risk, at least from this very non-scientific Paul, sorry, Pablo, absolutely non-scientific. For the audience, is actually default that is still more important. That might reflect the fact of Pablo about the plausibility and the fact that the legislation includes more detail about the plausibility of events in case of a default, including all the confidence intervals and the margin period of risks, which is not something arguably that is not included, as Pablo said, for non-default events. But I think the legislation is quite adequate from a couple of points of view. First of all, it talks about, it deals with non-default events, which is already something that we did not have that much before in previous. I think in a year, there's not so much depth about the treatment of non-defaults. So that's already something new and something welcomed. I think it is also very important something that it deals with something that the FSB work is also dealing with, which is not looking at non-default events in isolation, but it looks at non-default events and the potential for a combination of non-default and default events. So from that point of view, I think it's good. And in terms of the practical matters as a theory, but then how does that affect CCPs? How does that make our system more resilient? CCPs are required to have a recovery plan that reflects these two scenarios. So default and non-default on its own. So I think this is where how this legislation probably is quite important. It also provides authorities with the tools, with resources. It gives some guidelines about how authorities need to deal with non-default events and also, of course, default events. But of course, as we know, the FSB is looking into this matter. Is this enough? Do we really have enough resources at the end of the tail? And then I think finally, perhaps I should say that in terms of the treatment of non-default, while it's good to look at the recovery and resolution legislation, there is also a year that already deals with one part of non-default events, which is the investment risk of CCPs for sure, by providing a very conservative and prudent investment policy for CCPs. It is very much a preventive manner of dealing with non-default events. So from that point of view, I think it's quite adequate. I'm sure there's things that they still need to be addressed that have not been addressed. I'm not arguing for this to be addressed in the legislation, but definitely some operational issues that have to be addressed that I can think of. First of all, as we said, do authorities have enough resources? So this is something that the FSB definitely is taking the lead on that. But then also other operational issues like something very usual here in the euro area at least, access to euros. If a CCP receives or calls for a margin call before 3 Central European time, before 3 o'clock Central European time, they may need to get that margin call in US dollars because there is not enough time to pass that through the payment system of the ECB through Target 2 because it closes at 6. So longer opening time for Target 2 beyond 6. This could address a potential non-default event related to using of US dollars rather than euros. I'm sure this could be the case in other jurisdictions potentially with those CCPs using different currencies. The same happens if I expand on one of our favorite subjects of access to central banks in terms of the access to central banks in the very, very worst case scenario. This is also, there could be some liquidity issues, so again, it's a non-default issue. CCPs in Europe, they do only have potentially have access to central banks emergency facilities if they have a banking license for some of those facilities, and this is not the case elsewhere. So this really hinders the possibility for dealing with potential operational issues. So this is something that could potentially be looked at. And then 2 final points. Also related to operational, again on the liquidity point, something very topical nowadays, which is in terms of the energy markets. Something that we are seeing in some energy markets is that there's some utilities, some non-financial participants that are members, direct members of CCPs, and they do not have access to, central bank liquidity, which financial members do. So if we had the possibility for these members to provide collateral, that is, for example, bank guarantees, not fully backed bank guarantees, these would address a potentially operational issue in terms of liquidity of these participants. So I think those some ideas, as I said, not necessarily to include them in the legislation, but definitely some of them, especially I would say the energy one and the central bank and the access to central bank, something, and target 2 really, something quite urgent to hopefully deal with in terms of non-default.
Yes, well, I agree with you that we have to look at things and how to improve the current framework, in particular when we are talking about non-default losses or to non-financial participants and how they could access that in an effective manner to clearing. And I tend to think also that when we are talking about, let's say, the recovery phase, we have two aspects here to assess. First of all, from a supervisory perspective, what we would expect is basically that all losses could be allocated independently of whether we could understand that they are plausible or not, because we don't know what are going to happen in the future, and it is better if we are already prepared for any case, as I have already said, independently of they are found plausible or not. And then we have the problem of the quantification, which is basically in how we set the bar of the resources. Where are the resources that we are going to ask to the CCP to cover? What could be asked for the user, to the losses that could be covered by the user, and so on. I tend to think that these are basically the two questions that we look at very closely when we assess the recovery plans. So I would like also to ask you some other questions, Rafael. For example, do you think that the EU framework is more rigorous than the one in other jurisdictions, or it is entirely equivalent, for example, on how this issue is being addressed in the US or in the UK, and there could be some competitive advantage in some places or not? What do you think about all these aspects? That now, with as you know, the European Commission is very interested in finding the way in which EU CCP could be more competitive.
I'm so glad to be asked that question about equivalence and comparison of EU regime compared to others in a room full of people like Theo running the Global Association with all these members from different jurisdictions, and each as well having, I think, members in at least 4 different legislative jurisdictions, let's call it this way. So let's see how I address that. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, those of you in the room, definitely looking at Theo and the colleagues from that team and the colleagues from other jurisdictions, I think it's fair to say that the treatment of non-default losses is generally, at a high level, is generally well treated similarly in different legislations. In particular, looking at the EU, UK, and US. So apologies definitely for those in the rest of the jurisdiction. Looking at Agnes in Singapore and the rest of our Asian colleagues. I think overall, yes, it is probably well addressed. There is something that I find interesting, definitely in the EU, UK, and the US. They both address something that I'm sure it will create controversy on this side, and then we can have fun. Wait to hear from Natalia. So this is going to be great, which is what I call the polluter pays principle. So who's responsible for covering the non-default losses? This principle is something that is embedded in the three legislative frameworks, in the EU, in the UK, and in the US. So in the EU, you've got that in Recital 20 of Recovery and Resolution legislation. In the UK, there's Bank of England, that includes provisions around the need to look at who is responsible for the non-default losses. And then in the US, definitely, as far as I'm aware, looking at my colleagues here to correct me, but I think the CFTC definitely includes this in Title 17 regarding at least investment losses and some operational losses. So this is, and this is, I think, important, who bears the loss, because for non-default, I think it's fair to assume that CCP should be the one to take it. I think it's fair to make that assumption. But that might not be the case. You could have an investment policy that is led not just by the CCP, but perhaps is being negotiated also with clearing members. You may also have a custodian that has been chosen by a clearing member as opposed to the one suggested by the CCP. And then you could also have other events that, okay, perfectly could be an operational glitch, which could be definitely the fault of the CCP. So I think that principle of polluter pays principle is something that is interesting, that underpins the three legislative frameworks. So I think from that point of view, they're quite relevant. Perhaps the EU one, the one that I know best, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, in other jurisdictions, I think it may be a bit more detailed than in other jurisdictions. But again, as we said before, I think it's relatively high level what they include. They include the requirement for CCPs to have to include these events in their recovery plans. So hopefully that should be something included, I think, largely in other ones.
Okay, thank you, Rafael. And a last question, which is also interesting, at least from my side, which is basically how to apply the proportionality principle to the supervision, how we calibrate the supervisory pressure to small CCPs or to starting business of CCPs compared to big CCPs that we also have in the EU and we also have in the world. How could we solve the problem of finding the right balance between applying requirements, more or less the same set of requirements to big CCPs, to small CCPs? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's something that we very much looked at in our association, because proportionality, we've got some CCPs that are focused on perhaps one very niche particular market on the local equity space, and we've got other CCPs that have the broad spectrum of products being cleared. So proportionality, I think for non-default losses, there is perhaps, I'll just highlight one element that probably links to the previous question about comparison. I should have mentioned that before, which is an element that looks at proportionality, but also a comparison with our jurisdiction, which is the skin in the game. So it was mentioned before by one of the speakers, or a couple of the speakers, that the recovery and resolution legislation includes a requirement for a second skin in the game in the EU. So the EU was one of the few jurisdictions around the world that had a requirement for a first skin in the game, let alone a second skin in the game. And this second skin in the game, it is actually to be used both for default, but also non-default losses. And this second skin in the game, it is calibrated based on some proportionality requirements. So there's, I will mention some of them based on size, but it's not only size. There's more than size in proportionality. So I think from that point of view, there is an element of proportionality in the treatment of non-default losses. And I said that it links to the previous question about the comparison, because as far as I'm aware, do correct me if I'm wrong, the second skin in the game, definitely for non-default losses, I do not think it exists in a lot of places elsewhere. I know, Agnes, you do have quite a lot sort of skin in the game in general, but I'm not sure if it applies also to non-default losses requirements. But other than that, I think it's pretty unique and definitely proportional.
Yes, well, I think that's very typical in the EU. Thank you, Rafael. And I would like now to ask Natalia the views of the users of the CCP. So, how do you assess from a user's perspective the development of the European regulation?
Well, first of all, let me thank CNMV for inviting us to this conference. It is one thing that I really appreciate, and I have asked for in lots of different industry forums, is the fact that more and more we see collaboration between the different regulators. It really helps. I mean, a lot of the CCPs we talk about are very global, and I think when the risks are global, then the solution has to be global as well, right? When we come to non-default losses, I would be a lot less worried about investment losses, because I think in general the way CCPs are made to invest is very conservative, and I think it's, as Pablo was saying, very well regulated. When it comes to operational losses for a glitch or a human mistake, I think all in all that happens around the industry and it's fairly well taken care of. I would be more in the side of what Pablo says, of how much danger are we on cybersecurity risk and how plausible are they. So my issue in that sense is, yes, maybe the legislation is a little bit too lenient, but on the other hand, looking for the black swan where you have this, let's say, electromagnetic attack, that would not only affect CCPs, it would affect the industry at large. So I think when it comes to that point, yes, the regulator might have to come in, but the reality is, I think most of the market would stop. Because let's imagine a CCP dealing with futures, right? So if it doesn't start, there is no market. And I sit on a desk, right? So let's say when we have no futures, we don't trade because there is no way to price things. Therefore, it is a concern. I'm not debating it, but it is. I think we have to take it on a very global view of saying, if this happens, can we actually say, can we have CCP collaboration? Can we have rules where we can actually, if necessary, move the trading to another CCP for time-limited time scenario? What are the sort of things we can look to do rather than put more and more pressure on let's have money saved on the side? Because I get the feeling that it's not a question of the CCP going into recovery only, it's a question of the whole stability of the financial market. And that's where we really need to work on as an industry of saying, what is it that we can do? If the stock exchange doesn't open, definitely there will be volatility, but nothing's going to happen. Things won't trade, right? How long can we stand that? That is what we need to think about, in my point of view, right? So I think, it is very encouraging to see that regulators around the world are thinking more and more about these issues and coming to decisions that would help the whole industry if it comes to a point like this.
Okay, I think it's very interesting what you have said. I tend to think that in general there are different interactions between the CCPs and the user. So the system does not work in isolation. We cannot consider only the CCPs, we cannot consider only how the participants are functioning, but we have to look at the whole system. So that's why I tend to think that it is very important that the CCPs, in the context of their implementation of the recovery plans, they could test the different tools that they would apply in a context of the recovery. Do you think that the intervention or the participation of the users of the CCP in all those tests and all those recovery simulations is appropriate? Do you think that they should intervene more? They should be carried out more often?
Okay. Talking about all CCPs as if they were all the same is a bit of a wishful thinking. I'd love to say they're all the same, but unfortunately they're not. So in my personal experience of having to deal with different ones, they're not all equal in member participation. There are some of them which are very, very active in having members participate, and they constantly ask, where do you think we can improve? What do you think we can do? Etc., etc. It is also true that members have time limits, so this participation is not always equal by the members themselves. But there are some other CCPs that have like a few people they consult and they don't actually open it up to the whole membership or even clients, because sometimes you could get, the perspective of a clearing member is not necessarily the same as that of a client. So occasionally some of these consultations could actually go much, as we are doing currently with the EU location policy, is expanded to the whole universe of people who are involved in clearing. Now, I definitely think participation is important. I think it's important for the CCPs, and I think that's why they normally ask. I think it's important for the regulators, which again, that's why they normally ask. And I think it is important for the whole stability of the system, because there's always the chance that somebody will come up with an idea you haven't thought of. I mean, we are talking about sort of the black swan, so we don't know where it's coming from. But the more people who contribute, the more people who come up with, I think we could look at this or the other, I think that would be much more interesting.
Okay, thank you. And how about, for example, the participation that the user could have in the decision making, for example, in the development of the recovery plan or the definition of the rules that would be applied in certain cases, in particular for dealing in not default sourcing? Do you think that are appropriate? Do you think that they should improve? Do you think that, are you comfortable with that?
I think I'm currently very comfortable with everything except for cybersecurity, but I think cybersecurity is such a big animal in the room that, you know, it is really the elephant in the room. So, and, you know, I am sure after the invasion of Ukraine, cyber attacks have been plenty around CCPs in the world, because that's what's been happening, and we're all pretty much aware. It's not only happened in the CCPs, there has been a concerted effort to destabilize a little bit the financial world. I think being transparent about it is good. I think, you know, making the public aware that these things are happening is positive. I think collaboration between members, clients, CCPs would definitely improve things, and I think definitely the regulators should be in it, as they are.
Okay, thank you. And let's go to the key question, which is basically, how do you think the allocation of losses should be organized in case it's that, for example, the loss arise from an operational event? Do you think that participants should contribute to cover that loss? Do you think that should be the CCP itself, the one that should face all the losses? In that case, do you think that the CCP are well capitalized against that particular risk? What are the views of the participants, or your views regarding all these key questions?
Okay, we have debated this thing before, and as Rafa was saying before, the polluter system actually works. I mean, it's not that losses get immediately allocated to members, but it seems to me that in a lot of, and yes, CCPs do have a skin in the game, but CCPs are not banks. They don't have a big balance sheet behind them. So they have a certain amount of resources, which they will use if there's any kind of loss, but it's limited. And after that, normally it goes to members. And when I read through all the regulation, it gets to me at a certain point. If there was an event where you had a default event plus a non-default event coming together, which is, in my view, the real risk, that there's an equal risk of a default and a non-default happening pretty much at the same time. Because if you had a massive cyber attack, you could have one or two members going into default at the same time that the CCP is getting attacked. And there's a chance that that might happen. It is not the most obvious chance, but there's a chance that could happen. In which case, you're dealing with everything. Now, how many resources do members have to come up with in that kind of scenario is something that what we have to be careful is not to get to the point where the request of funds from the members is so great that we could actually end up with having another member having to go into recovery or resolution, because we'd only exacerbate the problem. So from my point of view, there has to be a status of limitation of saying, this is where the members cannot post anymore, and yes, we have to consider recovery or resolution coming from the authorities.
And one last question, which is also important for us to get your views, which is basically, do you feel that the transparency that or the information that you receive from the recovery plans or the recovery rules that could be applied from a particular CCP is adequate, or do you think that you don't receive sufficient information to assess what could be the real impact in case that the CCP gets into troubles?
I'm not quite so bothered about the transparency. I think most of the provisions of transparency are quite all right. It's the speed that is sometimes a bit worrying, because we need transparency from the very beginning, because otherwise there's a lot of things we cannot do to help. I mean, there are occasions where the participants could help, but they need to be informed fairly quickly. I mean, within the recovery and resolution legislation, how fast and how quickly the regulators go into the CCP and how they proceed is quite clear. How quickly or effectively members get informed is not quite as clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, now I think there is a turn of questions of the audience. If there is anyone who would like to ask the panel for a particular concern or question that they could have. Well, if there are no questions, I would like to appreciate the panelists for their contribution. That I think that they have been very interesting. All the contribution, all of the insight that they have offered us, provide us with all these questions that I think that are very important in these times. I mean, the challenge that we face to address potential non-default losses of CCPs, I tend to think that are quite important. So thank you very much for coming, and I give the floor to the next panel, which would be also interesting for all the audience. Thank you.
Well, good morning or good late morning to everybody. First, I would like to thank the CNMV for giving the opportunity to moderate this panel. Well, my experience is on banking resolution, not FMI resolution, but in the banking resolution framework. The FMI, financial market infrastructure, they have a significant role, especially in the chapter of operational continuity in resolution. The SRB, Single Resolution Board, has issued different guidances, operational guidances on operational continuity, contingency plans for FMIs, etc. But today the focus will not be on banks, will be on FMIs, because the authorities consider that there is a rationale to set up a recovery and resolution framework for these key players in the financial markets. Well, as time pressure soars at the end of every event, I think now it's time to hear the real experts on FMI's resolution. We have people representing the different stakeholders in this debate. We have Theo Flor from the CCP, from the central counterparties. We have Alexis Thompson from a member of the CCP, also a bank, but is a member of CCP. And we have two authorities, two resolution authorities. Miguel Kruse from the Bank of Spain and María José Gómez Lluvero from the, I say always Spanish Securities and Exchange Commission, but CNMV. And unfortunately, we don't have a representative from the buy side, because Stephen Fisher from BlackRock cannot attend the meeting today, this panel. So, well, without any further ado, I will start with a question to Theo. What is your view on the new framework? Do you think that is needed, or with the current framework is enough? What do you think about the new resolution framework for CCPs?
Yes, happy to go first. Thank you very much also for organizing the conference and invitation to speak. I assume you mean the EU framework. I think, of course, it is important that every of the major jurisdictions reflects in their local legislation how they want to implement the global standards. I think that for the work that the FSB, CPMI, and IOSCO already conducted in 2012, 2014, they established an excellent framework that, of course, built up and clarified some of the aspects of the PFMIs. I would say that in some jurisdictions, some of the hard work in describing how a CCP should avoid a failure or go into failure if the worst was to pass has predated those. The example of Hong Kong in '87 was mentioned. Of course, they did an enormous amount of work in the 90s to clarify some of those aspects there. So it is helpful to have it. It is helpful that it creates the role of a resolution authority. As was mentioned before, it of course distinguishes between NDLs and the normal default waterfall. So those are excellent aspects of it. It's great that it's there. I would say that if we look at historical events that academics have described back from the 1800s, I mean, CCPs tend to be more or less the same kind of machine. Lessons have of course been learned, but some of the key elements of how they're constructed have always been the same. And in that sense, I think the legislation itself doesn't introduce anything dramatically different. There are some curious ideas, there are some very good ones. I wouldn't expect that anything beyond the current very detailed RTSs which are in the works would be required for Europe.
Okay, so same question to Alexis, but from the perspective of a member of for a bank, Spanish bank, very large Spanish bank, a member of the CCPs. What is your view?
Sure. First of all, thanks for the invitation, although I have to admit this isn't a subject I really like talking about, to be honest with you. Preparing for this type of situation makes me a little bit nervous. And it's obviously something that we want to avoid. Now, having said that, obviously, on a general point, we can't stick our head in the sand and hope that this never happens. We have to prepare for it. And in that respect, we welcome the regulation. I think any regulation that tries to put certainty of how we need to act and what needs to happen in such an event, I think is always a great help. So in that sense, definitely we welcome it. Obviously, as you said, Spanish bank, we're obviously a member of the local CCP here in Spain, but we're also members of other CCPs around the world, LCH, Eurex. So obviously this is a topic of great interest for us. Lots of aspects have been talked about already, I think, during the morning of the regulation. So I think generally we think it's a great idea and it's great to have it. I'm going to bring up 3 points that I think, at least for us as a bank, I think are relevant. I think the first one, which I don't know exactly the word to use, perhaps surprising, we lifted an eyebrow, was the competent authority. I guess as a bank, we obviously have our own resolution plans. We are governed from Europe, but the CCP one here is, I think, is going to be dealt with. The competent authority is going to be the CNMV. Now, obviously, we understand where that's coming from, but for us, what is essential here, if we ever got to this point of recovery and resolution, is obviously how the different entities and governing bodies talk to each other. Because as has been said, I think all morning, the CCPs now are more global, the members are certainly global, the effects of a CCP going into resolution would be global and certainly not national. So, obviously we welcome that it's the CNMV, but there, I think the communication and the coordination between all the authorities around the world, I would say, not even just around Europe, I think is essential in this part. The second aspect as well, again, it's been slightly mentioned today, but not all members of CCPs are necessarily banks. There are a lot of non-financial institutions who are also members of CCPs. And obviously the effect, maybe that's not the case in Spain, but certainly in other ones. But obviously, again, that for us, perhaps they need to be looked at in a different way, dealt with in a different way, because obviously the requirements, I think, already put on banks in terms of recovery, resolution, etc., are, I think, already quite stringent. So that's probably another aspect that needs to be looked at. And then thirdly, and I guess maybe more controversially, is the use of variation margin in a possible scenario where we come into problems. Now, as you know, most derivatives, they're used quite widely for hedging. Now, if those benefits from the derivatives, the positives, are kept back to cover potential losses and not be able to use to hedge against other positions, maybe in cash markets, by the members, that could cause, and I think someone mentioned it earlier this morning as well, that could cause potentially members who are not in problems to actually get into problems because they're not benefiting from the benefits that they get from the positive P&Ls and the negative P&Ls and netting those off. So we could actually, in an attempt to help the CCP, actually perhaps cause a member to go into problems, which is something that obviously we want to avoid with all of this. So obviously, great regulation, we welcome it, it gives clarity, I think, of how we need to act, but I think there's certain points still that maybe for us raise eyebrows.
Okay, so if anybody wants to react or to make a comment, for me no problem. Okay, so the third question is for Miguel Cruz, and the same question. What are your views on the new regulation, the new framework, and if, do you perceive any challenge, special challenge?
Yes, thank you. First of all, well, I would also like to thank CNMV for organizing this event and for inviting us. In my humble opinion, this new regulation, it's a logical step following the increasing importance of the CCPs achieved during these recent years. They have become critical components of the global financial markets, and therefore critical parts for the global financial stability. So in this sense, as it was the case with the bank resolution framework some years ago, I think it is necessary to have in place a robust recovery and resolution framework which allows to preserve the continuity of the critical functions that the CCPs provide, to minimize adverse effects on the real economy, to preserve financial stability, and to avoid to the maximum extent the need to inject public funds in case there is a failure. As I was mentioning, we have since back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, a very similar regulatory framework. In fact, it was mentioned this morning that the philosophy behind this new regulation comes from the one on the banking sector. I think it makes sense, especially because especially banks and CCPs, play a key role in the global financial markets and financial stability. And in many cases, banks are the clearing members of the CCPs, so this new framework perfectly complements the one that we already had in place in the banking sector. Taking what Alexis was mentioning before, I couldn't agree more with you on the need to cooperate closely between the authorities. There is a need to cooperate very close, to have a mutual understanding of the actions that may be adopted by both authorities on these two fields. And for this, in any case, we will have a number of aspects or possibilities included in the regulation that have worked pretty well in the field of the banking sector, in the field of bank resolution planning. And I guess they could be applied also in a successful manner in the field of CCPs. Just only to mention, for instance, we had the opportunity to work together here with Maria Jose and CNMV colleagues in the CMG of an FMI. And I think this is precisely the right way to do this and to organize these kind of meetings regularly, at least on a yearly basis, to exchange all the necessary information and to be prepared in advance during peace times for whatever may come.
Okay. No, I agree with you. Probably the FMI resolution framework is looking at the bank resolution framework, but it's not the same. For example, I heard in the previous panel that liquidity could be considered a non-default event. In the case of FMI's resolution framework. Fortunately for the other framework, for the bank resolution, liquidity, for example, in the case of Banco Popular, was a default event, and it has been ratified by the European Court of Justice. Okay, so Maria Jose, well, I think she mentioned her views on the current framework this morning, so I will change the question for her. From the perspective of the new resolution authority for FMIs, how effective you think that are resolution tools, and how they can affect the proper functioning of the market and financial stability?
Thank you, Antonio, for this direct question, not easy to answer. Let me approach to the response to this question saying first that one of the objectives of resolution is, as you all know, is to ensure the continuity of critical functions, preserving financial stability. This has been already said several times. And the choice of resolution tools has to take into account, in addition to other circumstances, any linked FMI and third parties, either clearing members, clients, even service providers, regardless of where they are located, as well as obviously the expected impact in financial markets. This assessment has to be carried out by the resolution authority both at the time of drawing up the resolution plan and in the event of having to decide on effective resolution tools or an effective resolution. Speaking about effective effects on financial stability, can occur through different channels, but simplifying, I would say that at least the so-called first round effects could occur through the impact on solvency, but mainly on liquidity of participants in a CCP, on mainly clearing members, because the CCP and banks, you know that, are highly interconnected. Also, we have to take into account externalities, such as the behavior of participants, of market participants, and second, another round effects that might result in a wider knock-on market stress, including potential pro-cyclical effects, such as an increase in margin requirements, liquidity pressure, and collateral scarcity. All these are obviously more difficult to predict and more difficult to assess also. The recovery or the resolution of a CCP could create liquidity pressure on clearing members, and this in turn could also affect the liquidity of CCPs themselves. As the severity of the stress intensifies, the exponential loss of confidence among market participants could result in a situation where recovery or resolution could not work as expected. So the impact on market liquidity and the confidence on the CCP are probably the most relevant risk factors related to the use of any kind of tool. And here there are different positions, as we have already seen from different speakers. There are mixed opinions. On one hand, banking supervisors, as well as clearing members, as Natalia also mentioned in the previous panel, are more inclined to apply quantitative limits to the obligations of clearing members in a resolution in order to gain certainty and to limit externalities, while normally CCP supervisors are cautious in this sense due to the possible insufficient coverage of losses. So I stop here on this difficult question nowadays to
Any reaction?
to answer.
Theo?
Of course, yeah. Just one thing I would mention before for the communication between the authorities. Since most CCP's largest members tend to be banks, I mean, CCPs are sort of at the receiving end of the decision of a resolution authority, right? So if a banking resolution authority decides that the clearing business or the investment bank business, whatever part of the bank is a member of a local or foreign CCP, CCP's sort of in some sense worst default scenarios come when one resolution authority decides to let many of their members go. So I think that communication between the bank's resolution authorities and the CCP's authorities is essential, so I would really agree with what was said before. I mean, my reaction is I don't think it's controversial that CCPs allocate losses. I mean, that's what they're for. Some haven't remembered this, but just as an example for the Hong Kong case, I mean, at the time, the way the Hong Kong Futures Exchange, the predecessor of the financial market infrastructures in Hong Kong, was arranged, you had a financial guarantee corporation, you had a clearinghouse, and you had the exchange. And one of the problems that was uncovered with this arrangement was if you try to dissect the assets and liabilities, then you, of course, dramatically affect the incentives if something moves dramatically. So if the market's moved 44% down on an opening because of a variety of circumstances, then separating the two changes the incentives. And I guess for most CCPs, it's obvious that if you try to replace the existing waterfall with other resources, either the other resources are, for instance, public money, which was ruled out in many of the speeches this morning, or you're spreading contagion to somewhere else. And that might be beneficial in the sense that it diminishes the impact on the direct members, but it does affect their interest in making sure that those scenarios don't happen. And I guess CCPs are always nervous that their members walk away. So this is sort of part of where that perspective comes from. So the incentives are really intended to be understood as linking the asset and liability, linking continuity and paying for it. Of course, there is CCP skin in the game, there are resources. There is an interesting now level of detail in the EU legislation on the client leg of how losses might be passed down. But that's essentially sort of the summary of the CCP perspective, if I may say so, on behalf of everyone, and what Rafael said before.
Okay. Well, we can start the second round of questions also with Theo. You mentioned the EU regulation, but what are the pros and cons, in your view, of that regulation for third country CCPs?
So I suppose on a high level, I mean, equivalence is always a keen interest for CCPs. I mean, just to pick a local example, Spanish banks are very successful clearing members in Latin America. And it has been a long challenge for recognition of Latin American CCPs from ESMA. And I guess one concern for many CCPs is that if there is a clause in recovery and resolution legislation that is additive to existing equivalence discussions, this might further complicate things. So I think that's one distinction. Naturally, there are various resolution frameworks where I think outcomes-based approaches is sensible and necessary, because in the detail, especially of how national resolution authorities are different, it would be very difficult to have a sort of line-by-line comparison between the two. So I guess that's one view. We've of course also responded to the ESMA consultation, so there's keen interest because Europe has been so detailed in how they've drafted this.
Okay, Alexis, from your perspective, how does the new regulation affect the clearing incentives scheme, and what are the main implications for the solvency and liquidity of banks?
Yeah, good question as well. I mean, let's not forget, I think that there are a lot of measures in place before we ever get to this situation. So, you know, we are really always talking about an extreme situation, which can occur, which we hope will never occur, but it can occur. So, you know, I think that we all have to take into account. I guess on the financial stability side, and again, I think it's been a recurrent theme this morning of measures that could happen that could actually create financial instability with an attempt to avoid a CCP going into recovery or resolution. For example, I think there's a point in the legislation that talks about additional funds having to be made to the guarantee fund of up to 200%. Now that could put, I guess, some pressure on some members if they had to re-input, you know, up to 200%. I think that is probably that could cause problems. The skin in the game that has come up again and again during the morning. You know, do we need to increase that? Does that need to be looked at? Probably yes, and probably certainly. And you know, Rafael's already looking at me with evil eyes. You know, especially with the non-financial default. You know, does that need to be looked at more in that respect? You know, I'm going to throw it out there. But it's certainly, again, you know, we all talk from our different corners, and I'm talking from a bank and a clearing member corner, and I think that is, I think that's probably something that is going to be a conversation that is going to carry on. And then the public funds. I mean, the public funds, which again, you know, we may like it, we may not like it. I know it's controversial. Should it be there? I honestly believe it should be there as a very last resort. And we've, you know, if we go back not too far in history, perhaps we would have liked public money to have been used in other instances that it wasn't, and you know, banks were left to fail, and you know, there were big consequences for that. So should it be used? Now the question is how? Who actually pays for it? You know, is it the country where the CCP is domiciled. I think that's what it is the case today. But should it be that? Now we're in a global market. CCPs have international members. We're in Europe, not just in Spain. We're part of Europe. Should there be a European fund for it? Again, that I think will be continued discussions with the aim of not creating financial instability with measures that are in place there to I guess, save or support a CCP.
Okay. Well, another question to Miguel. And I mentioned that FMIs have a significant role in the bank resolution regime. And now, for example, banks are working under the scope of the resolution planning activity on contingency plans with FMIs, especially systemic CCPs. In those plans, banks are required to set a communication protocol with the CCP and a clear understanding on the decisions that the CCP would take in a scenario of a serious bank crisis. In the other side, in the FMI resolution framework, the same approach is required for banks if a CCP fails. Are authorities working in a coordinated way to tackle this reality?
Well, thank you for this short question. I will try to tackle it the best way I can. Well, certainly authorities have already taken steps and are coordinating in this regard. I was mentioning before the cooperation that we at Bank of Spain, together with other authorities, including the Single Resolution Board, have had in the context of crisis management groups. But in light of this new framework and the number of systemic CCPs and clearing members that may be located in different jurisdictions, may present different characteristics, being significant, not significant, etc., there is no doubt that there will be a number of additional authorities involved, and in order to get to cooperate closely, that would be a challenge. No? In any case, the regulation, following the philosophy of this banking resolution and recovery framework, already foresees a number of instruments to tackle this. And for instance, there is the possibility to sign cooperation agreements, always subject to confidentiality legislation. There is the possibility of organizing these supervisory colleges around the treatment of the recovery plans, resolution colleges where authorities can discuss everything around the resolution plans. They are typically invited to each other so that they know exactly what is in the recovery plan and if this may pose an obstacle to a resolution at a later stage. And the other way around, if we, for whatever reason, include something in the resolution plans that may affect the institutions or the CCPs in this case in going concern. And finally, we have the crisis management groups, which involve both authorities and also third countries, the most important ones. I think this has been working pretty well in the field of bank resolution planning so far, especially in the banking union together with the Single Resolution Board. And these are the right fora to exchange all kinds of information and be prepared in advance for whatever may come. Coming back to what Maria Jose was mentioning before, I don't see such a conflict between the authorities in charge of CCPs and the authorities in charge of banks. I think the only thing we should do is just to have very clear in mind through the analysis of potential scenarios, having a clear understanding of what may be requested at a point in time, asking the banks to be really aware of the requirements that may come from the FMIs at a point in time, in order to avoid, let's say, last-minute surprises. I remember back in 2012, the banking crisis, one of the things that I remember the most when our premium risk went to 630 basis points, something like that, was the increase in the requirements that came from some FMIs at a very short notice. So this has to be pretty well understood in advance in order to prepare also the clearing members to be able to react on time and to minimize possible, let's say, undesired effects coming from one part to the other. That's why cooperation is there. And I think we have the right tools to do it. So trying to finalize my answer, I think, to be honest, there is still some work to be done in this regard. If I'm not mistaken, the European Banking Authority published some guidelines at the beginning of 2022, guidelines on improving resolvability for credit institutions and resolution authorities. And one of the things they are requesting is precisely to come to these cooperation agreements between the authorities. We have until January 2024 to finalize this. And in my humble opinion, it would make sense in light of the number of authorities that may be involved to have, for instance, within the banking union, whenever this is feasible, to have a common approach or a joint approach together with a single resolution board to the authorities in charge of the most systemic CCPs, instead of doing it at the level of each national resolution authority, to simplify things, because in the end, most of the banks are operating with the most systemic CCPs. They are more or less the same. And if for whatever reason the work needs to be prioritized, I think it would be important to focus first on clearly on the most systemic CCPs, and on the side of the clearing members, going for the authorities in charge of the most important banks, or by volume of activity, or the ones that could be more critical for the FMIs themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
you suffer both regulations. So please.
I mean, you know, it's music to my ears. I mean, it's true. It's and even I think Anna was talking about it this morning when they were looking through the regulation and they were doing all the negotiations, and they were looking constantly at the resolution plans that were already in place for the banks to try and make them coincide and be similar. But for us, this is fundamental. You know, as I said earlier, you know, we're members of CME in the US, LCH, Eurex here in Spain. And obviously, if a bank potentially gets into problems, he's going to get into problems, possibly not just in one CCP, but in various CCPs. And the knock-on effect there could be important. So any type of, and all types of collaborations, I think, between the different authorities, between the different CCPs directly themselves, because they're ultimately affected. That's what I think from a bank point of view, and from a clearing member point of view, that's something that we obviously encourage, we welcome, and we like to hear when we're here, and we hear you guys mentioning all of that, and Anna was mentioning it before. Certainly for us, I think it makes our lives a little bit easier, and again, it adds to stability, to there being a clear pathway that when problems come, how do we need to act? What are the steps that need to be taken? And I think the more coordination that exists, I think makes all that transition a lot smoother. So from our point of view, obviously, you know, we welcome all of that, and it's greatly helpful.
Mm-hmm. If I may, yes, thank you, Antonio. It sounds fantastic for me too, what I'm listening to today, because collaboration between authorities, not only in a transsectorial way, but also in a jurisdictional way, is essential. As I mentioned this morning in my first intervention, it is in the agenda of the FSB how to improve the cooperation and the collaboration among authorities, not only between resolution authorities, but also with supervisors, with resolution authorities of banks, of clearing members, but also with other kind of agencies and authorities, for example, dealing with cyber security issues and these other new topics that are nowadays on board. Another aspect which is absolutely important and relevant from the perspective of a CCP resolution authority is also transparency. The confidentiality sometimes is an obstacle to collaborate and to improve the collaboration between authorities. As I always say that the resolution regime of clearing members is another line of defense of CCPs. So the collaboration is essential. It is also essential for a resolution authority of a CCP to know how the resolution plan of a clearing member, of a significant clearing member, intends to deal with a crisis of such a clearing member. It is essential. But nowadays, all those aspects have to be or need to be, let's say, improved, or, well, we don't have experience today on these issues, fortunately, but I think that it is an interesting discussion that will be on board.
Okay. Sometimes the governance framework seems difficult, seems complicated. For example, in the case of the bank resolution framework, and well, finally in practice, when you have a problem, and I've experienced some particular problems with banks, I think everything can be settled in a right way. For example, in the case of the European Commission, the role of the European Commission in the bank resolution regime, if you have the European Commission on board, for example, even in a very conflictive issue like Banco Popular, if you have the Commission on board since the beginning of the process, no problem. So sometimes it's complicated to manage the governance framework, but in practice, usually it's it's easier. Okay, a question for Maria Jose. I think you said this morning that the FSB is analyzing whether the tools and financial resources provided by the current regulation and the FSB principles are sufficient, or whether alternative tools and resources are needed. Does this mean that the tools provided are not sufficiently effective? What types of alternative resources or tools could be considered in your view?
Well, this is also an interesting and controversial question, also for many stakeholders, because the document that
I'm
has
sure
been...
that Theo will answer it.
I'm sure. The document that was published by the FSB in March this year was, well, really controversial. We have received different positions from stakeholders, from CCPs, from the buy side, from clearing members, and so on, and opinions are quite different. While many of the stakeholders, or a part of the stakeholders, may find that any additional work is not needed, in fact, because of how unlikely a CCP resolution scenario are, how unlikely these scenarios are, other stakeholders, for example, clearing members, do not share, obviously, that view. And policymakers, we are in general of the view that it is important to consider what if scenarios. What if something goes wrong? I mean, given the low probability of, but the very high impact of any CCP failure, there is a need to be prepared for such a what if scenarios. We all remember, as a colleague of mine at the FSB mentioned recently, we all remember that the Titanic was designed to be unsinkable, but recent and unanticipated geopolitical events demonstrate that shocks could be even more extreme than past historical events, responding also to the question posed by our colleague Pablo in the previous panel about plausibility. Plausibility is a real concept which could be revised in light of recent events. So, asking to your question, what are the possible alternative resources that could be considered in this new work, this ongoing work of the FSB? Let me take a look at my paper in order not to forget those eventual tools that we are considering. For example, one of them could be to require clearing members or even other external investors to subscribe bail-in bonds, which in the event of a CCP failure would be written off or would be written down to cover losses, or partially could be converted into equity to restore the CCP capital requirements. Another possible resource or tool could be to increase the pre-funded equity to be held by CCPs to improve loss absorbing capacity, in particular for specific non-default losses. Another could be a second tranche of pre-funded dedicated own resources, a second tranche, a second skin in the game, which could also be used in different stages or in different moments in the default waterfall. Another could be the contractually agreed committed resources from CCP's parent or affiliated company to provide financial support in resolution. Also, a dedicated pre-funded emergency fund for either each CCP or on a cross CCP basis, such as a backstop similar to the resolution fund that we have in the European Union for banks. And this fund could be called upon by a resolution authority in order to absorb losses, to recapitalize the CCP, to provide liquidity, or even to compensate non-creditor worse-off claims for clearing members. And last also, but not least in this case, we also may consider contingent resources based on contracts such as insurance policies. So in any case, let me clarify very clearly, as I mentioned this morning, that at this stage the work is not finished and that this is an exploratory work. No conclusions are made up from the start of the work. We are going to, the FSB members, we are undertaking a thorough analysis of both cost and benefits, including the impact on incentives, on the delicate structure of incentives, which in any case has to be respected. And also we will consider the suitability of each potential resources or tools in the light of certainty with regard to the sufficiency of resources to cope with a potential crisis, either idiosyncratic or systemic, which is also an important distinction, and with regard to other factors. Also, the FSB work will take into account and be complementary to the work underway by the CPMI IOSCO on CCP practices to address non-default losses. And obviously, as I mentioned this morning, and I want to insist on this idea, the feedback from industry and the academia will be counted on, and the execution of this work and all the public consultations that are necessary to adequately address all the interest involved will be carried out.
What are your preferences among this long list of alternative resources?
So I mean, a CCP is a sort of closed system with its participants, right? So there are profits and losses that are shuffled between them, and you assume that you can't get funds from somewhere else. So if EMGH is unattractive, then cash call is an alternative, but something has to give, right? You can't perform on the contracts unless you get funds from somewhere else. So there's a great temptation that they could come from somewhere else. there are lots of other proposals. Usually alternative resources are attractive when somebody else needs to pay, right? So the clients say, well, the clearing members obviously have default fund that should be just topped up. Everyone agrees the CCP should pay, of course. I think the difficulty with some of the tools is that they already exist, right? So skin in the game, all these things. There's a huge debate constantly on what is the right calibration. So one reason why CCPs are very safe is because their members keep them on their toes, right? Is cyber well handled? Natalia will come and bang on everyone's heads. BBVA will knock on everyone's doors and say, actually, we don't like the way you're doing your cash calls. We'd prefer another tool. So, of course, no particular member should ever be too happy, right? So everyone's always angry, but that's how it works, and that's what makes them quite safe. And this was, I think, why the regulators wanted more clearing. The idea that you find a separate source, unless you have public money, is difficult. Either you're moving the buck out somewhere outside the system, and this is especially dangerous in a waterfall where you pay first and then at some stage somebody else pays. You will have enormous incentives to minimize what the pre-funded resources that hit you are. So I think this is why CCPs sort of come off as quite, I would say, a hardline, or maybe only I do, but sort of very doctrinaire about how the waterfall shouldn't be changed too much. So I think for TLAC, if it's a forced subscription to the clearing members, then you park money in a central bank account and then you tell them you won't pay them back if all goes badly. This is not too different from the existing waterfall structure of pre-funded default fund plus cash calls. Mm-hmm. So I think that these ideas are difficult because they have the danger of really changing how a CCP works. The other reason I think why we responded that we don't think further work is necessary is the FSB concluded that for the systemically important CCPs in more than one jurisdiction, they can do cover 4. So I'm reserving, by the way, all of my remarks very clearly for default losses. For non-default losses, many CCPs do have insurance policies. Of course, CCPs are responsible for the bulk of, for instance, operational losses they cause themselves and all those things, as Rafael mentioned, polluter pays kind of principle. So for the default losses, I think that's sort of the challenge. On one hand, at the moment, CCPs are qualified by regulators, by the members, sometimes even the CCPs themselves as being sufficiently robust. And these other resources run the risk that they really change the incentive structure. So if I had to pick, I mean, yeah, no, I couldn't. It would sort of have to be a negative ranking. No.
Okay.
Alexis, don't be shy. I mean, I was listening to the list and I just kept thinking, she's asking me for more money. She's asking me for more money. She's asking me for more money. I didn't get any sense of the CCP has to be more responsible. But then I'm talking from a bank, so yeah. That's just my selective hearing. Part of me agrees with you, of course. You know, we are there, again, not the non-financial stuff. The financial stuff, we're members of the CCP, and it's either us or a client of ours who's going to cause a problem if there is one. So obviously we have to be held responsible. And I agree totally with you. Money has to come from somewhere. If it's not from here, it's from there, it's from in front. You know, it doesn't just magically appear. So I agree, it is a big challenge. I don't know whether the contra to that is participating more as a member in how the CCP is run, governed, membership process. I honestly don't know. Maybe that's, again, you know, if you want me to be or put more money up, then I guess I want more of a say in what's going on in the CCP. You know, how are your risk controls? How is your membership screening evolving, and what are you doing in that sense? Again, ideas thrown out. I do coincide with you. Please don't ask me to pick one, because I don't think I am able to pick one. It's definitely a complex thing, but I think it's in everyone's interest that the CCPs work. You know, I've been in CCPs all my professional life. I started working in this industry, and when I started working, we were the weird ones in the corner that no one really used. Now we're fundamental for the financial industry. Sorry, we were the weird ones in the corner that no one used and no one understood. You know, no one understood anything. But now we're fundamental for it. So it's in all our interest. Again, you know, I've said it twice, I'll say it again, that we never get to a point of God forbid, resolution of a CCP.
Okay. Miguel, given that some CCPs operate in different jurisdictions or with members headquartered in different jurisdictions, do you think that this could be a challenge for the effective implementation of the new framework?
Well, coming back to what I was mentioning before, I think all things equal, the higher the number of authorities involved, the more complex it's going to be. But again, the regulation foresees a number of instruments. I think we have both experienced incredibly large meetings of CMGs with some of the most important banks global-wide, all over the world. And even if it sounds a little bit incredible, it works. You have a fora to exchange information, to get to know each other, to know exactly who's going to do what in case something happens. And it is important to have these contacts on a regular basis to anticipate all the problems that may arise and to be prepared for the situation in which we hope we never are confronted with these situations. It was mentioned this morning. I think it is something that is mentioned a lot at the level of the SRB. We hope for the best, but we plan for the worst. And this is the right fora. It's a challenge indeed, but I think it can be overcome with these measures, and the proof is already on the banking sector, where we have had to deal with most systemic banks in the world.
Okay, so now a volunteer for the next question. Is the possible risks of the application of some tools, especially the variation, margin gain, haircutting?
You said volunteers. So
Maria Jose also.
Before I had the pleasure of this job, I worked at a CCP that didn't have VMGH. So it was PTUs and cash calls, so there's no VMGH. I think you sort of get two flavors of those that like variation, margin gains, haircutting. Those where it's everything, which means it's comprehensive, so you're fulfilling your PFMIs. And the CCP takes in everything that it's owed and it pays out potentially ultimately nothing. But then that takes care of all of the credit, all of the losses, and the CCP will somehow then either rebalance itself by finding new buyers or sellers, or it will be able to just sort of coast along. Then there's the version where you specifically limit it to a particular amount, so either absolute or relative to the size of the trades, and upon reaching that point, you move over to another tool. So I think that those are the two typical flavors. It has a sort of philosophical elegance in how clean it is. The CCP I worked at we didn't like it because we had futures and options, and this would have been extremely complicated for premium style options to incorporate, so it works better obviously in certain asset classes. For repos and other types of cash markets, it can be quite complex to force sell, but you do have buy-in rules which sometimes economically look relatively similar. I've waffled around a bit. Have I sort of not volunteered myself for the question yet?
Okay, so I think before the possible reaction of Maria Jose, anybody in the room wants to ask a question? Yeah. I think there is a microphone, yeah. No.
Thanks. Rafael Plata from the European Association of CCPs. I'd like to react to, I think Alexis, definitely, I owe you one. Actually, no, but it was really interesting when you mentioned that when Maria Jose was listing the different tools that resolution authorities could have, and you said, I was thinking, I need to pay that, I need to pay that, I need to pay that. I had just made a comment 2 minutes before to my colleagues, we need to pay that, we need to pay that, we need to pay that. So I guess that
all yours.
I guess the question is for Maria Jose. Do you, in the discussions with global authorities, do you guys have a preconceived view about who should pay that, or is it just we just exploring that? Because I thought it was really interesting, especially with your comment, Alexis, that we were both looking at it from totally opposite perspectives. Thank you.
Well, Rafael, you know that this is a difficult question, that we are exploring different possibilities, that these issues have been put on board in different FSB consultations, and the positions from different stakeholders are very, very far from each other. As I mentioned when I was reading the list, the issue, for example, of bail-in bonds is not clearly. The idea is to explore what would happen if clearing members were to subscribe bail-in bonds, or there would be the possibility for any other kind of investors that could be underwrite such bail-in bonds. It is the same as other resolution tools. As I mentioned, again, the conclusions are not from the beginning, are not made at the starting point. This is an exploratory work. This is a very important issue to bear in mind, and the idea is to first identify eventual resources or tools which could be alternative or complement the current toolkit. And the idea is to analyze cost and benefits, but not only in an isolated way. When I say an isolated way, I mean on an individual basis from each alternative resource, but also any resource or tool vis-a-vis the current toolkit. The idea is to try to understand what would be the impact on functioning of markets, on financial stability, and so on. Obviously, it is not the same to apply variation margin gain haircutting, for example, which is a very controversial tool because it may have impact in hedging. It may impact in clients of clearing members. It is not the same to call for cash calls or to decide to tear up contracts, to cancel contracts. We've seen recently the decision by exchange to cancel nickel contracts and the reaction and the impact of such a decision. So, well, the objective at this point, at this stage of the work, is to explore, to analyze, to compare, to consult to all the stakeholders, CCPs, clearing members, academia, as I mentioned at the beginning, and to find the best way to go forward.
But I'm glad you thought that way, Rafael, because I think it gives a sense of collective responsibility, though. You know, you were thinking you were going to have to pay, I was thinking I was going to have to pay as a member. So at the end of the day, it has to be together. If we don't do it together and work together, then nothing's going to work. So I kind of like that you thought, you know, you have that responsibility, I have it, we all have it. And that's the only way that we're going to make this work, I think. Very idealistic, I know. No. I know, but I was going to say, you know, I'm trying to be on the positive side here.
Oh no, I'm just amused because I think if, you know, Maria Jose, you went back to the FDIC and you said emergency funds, they would think, oh, you mean us, right? I mean, I think it's...
So more, this question has been very productive. 3 answers with 1 question. So please, anybody who wants to... Not? Okay, so before finishing, as a master of ceremony, not a moderator, I want to introduce the next and final speaker, is the Pablo Ramón Laca, the Director General of the Spanish Treasury. So thank you very much.
Buenos días. Siguiendo instrucciones, voy a hablar primero en español y después decir unas palabras en inglés, reconociendo el carácter internacional del público de hoy. Buenos días. Me gustaría comenzar esta intervención agradeciendo a la Comisión Nacional del Mercado de Valores por la oportunidad de participar y de clausurar esta conferencia sobre una cuestión tan actual y de vital importancia para nuestros mercados financieros como es la recuperación y resolución de entidades de contrapartida central. Querría también transmitir mis agradecimientos a todas las personas que han intervenido previamente, así como dar la bienvenida a actores de referencia como la European Association of CCP Clearinghouses y CCP12. Es un verdadero placer tenerles aquí con nosotros. La recuperación y resolución de las entidades de contrapartida central, como apuntaba anteriormente, es un asunto esencial a la hora de garantizar la estabilidad financiera, no solo dentro de la Unión Europea, sino también a nivel global. Si algo nos han enseñado los últimos 15 años, es que los retos que plantea un panorama financiero globalizado y marcado por una creciente interdependencia no pueden ser abordados de forma eficaz solo a nivel nacional, sino que precisan de una acción conjunta que involucre al mayor número de actores posible. Desde su creación, la Unión Europea se ha caracterizado por afrontar de manera conjunta los retos comunes a sus Estados miembros. La aprobación de este nuevo Reglamento Europeo de Recuperación y Resolución de CCPs supone un claro paso adelante hacia la estabilidad financiera, un objetivo de vital importancia en el contexto económico y geopolítico actual. En los 2 últimos años, no necesito recordarlo, las economías mundiales han tenido que enfrentarse a importantes retos provocados por shocks externos, como son la pandemia del COVID-19 y posteriormente la injustificada invasión rusa de Ucrania. En consecuencia, el contexto actual viene marcado por la incertidumbre, el incremento del endeudamiento público y el crecimiento de la inflación hasta niveles no vistos en las últimas décadas, especialmente en los precios de las materias primas y de la energía. Esto último ha propiciado recientemente un necesario giro en la política monetaria por parte del Banco Central Europeo, que previsiblemente supondrá un aumento de los tipos de interés y que deberá ser progresivo y predecible. Estos shocks externos han motivado una revisión a la baja de las perspectivas de crecimiento y anticipan un futuro incierto para los próximos años. No obstante, gracias a las reformas estructurales emprendidas después de la crisis de 2008, tanto a nivel nacional como a nivel europeo, y a las lecciones aprendidas desde entonces, el sector financiero y el Tesoro Público en particular gozan de buena salud y se encuentran en condiciones de afrontar el escenario próximo. Asimismo, la progresiva implementación del Plan de Recuperación, Transformación y Resiliencia, con su ambiciosa combinación de inversiones y reformas, y la adopción de instrumentos como el Plan Nacional de Respuesta a las Consecuencias de la Guerra en Ucrania, han fortalecido nuestra economía y resistirá mejor estos golpes. No obstante, en estas circunstancias de volatilidad de mercado, el clearing y el papel de las entidades de contrapartida central adquieren una gran relevancia a la hora de garantizar la estabilidad financiera. Los mercados de derivados permiten proteger y gestionar riesgos y canalizar la inversión de los distintos agentes económicos. Las CCPs, como prestadoras de servicios de clearing, son agentes plenamente capacitados para actuar como intermediarios centralizados en los contratos de derivados y otros productos. Cumplen una función decisiva en la gestión del riesgo de contrapartida. Por su papel estratégico, resulta imprescindible que estas entidades de contrapartida central dispongan de un marco regulatorio bien calibrado en lo que afecta a su diseño, estructura, funciones y supervisión, pero también en lo referente a su recuperación y resolución en caso de dificultades. Aunque durante todos estos años el reglamento EMIR ha constituido el marco general para las entidades de contrapartida central, quedaba pendiente un marco de recuperación y resolución que permitiese gestionar las situaciones en las que estas entidades pudiesen afrontar dificultades financieras o incluso incumplimientos por parte de sus miembros compensadores. ¿Qué supone, por tanto, el nuevo reglamento de recuperación y resolución? El principal objetivo del marco de recuperación y resolución, cuya entrada en vigor tendrá lugar el próximo 12 de agosto, es el de garantizar que las entidades de contrapartida central establezcan medidas para, primero, recuperarse de las eventuales dificultades financieras. Segundo, mantener las funciones esenciales de las entidades inviables mientras se liquidan las actividades restantes. Tercero, preservar la estabilidad financiera y, por último, evitar un efecto adverso significativo sobre el sistema financiero y su capacidad para contribuir a la economía real, minimizando así, al mismo tiempo, el coste de la inviabilidad de una CCP para el erario público. Por tanto, el marco de recuperación y resolución articula un sistema preventivo y reactivo que facilitará la recuperación de las entidades de contrapartida central en situaciones de dificultad financiera y, eventualmente, garantizará una resolución ordenada que no comprometa la estabilidad financiera de la Unión Europea. Sin embargo, la aprobación de este necesario reglamento de recuperación y resolución de las CCPs debe entenderse como una parte de un objetivo más ambicioso: la creación de un marco competitivo que refuerce el clearing dentro de la Unión Europea. En un contexto post-Brexit, el clearing en la Unión Europea se encuentra en una situación compleja. Por un lado, existe una gran dependencia de las CCPs británicas de importancia sistémica, lo cual podría llegar a comprometer la autonomía estratégica y financiera de la Unión Europea y materializarse en un riesgo importante para los miembros compensadores y los clientes europeos. Por otro lado, trasladar el clearing de una jurisdicción a otra no es tarea fácil, ya que por su estructura de economías de escala, los servicios de compensación tienden a concentrarse en unas pocas entidades, por lo que todo cambio debe calibrarse correctamente y de forma progresiva. Precisamente, el pasado mes de febrero se extendió la equivalencia para las CCPs británicas sistémicas hasta el 30 de junio de 2025. Nuestro mensaje en este sentido es claro: necesitamos autonomía estratégica, pero también asegurar la estabilidad financiera aprovechando en lo posible la infraestructura que ya existe. Por todo ello, los Estados miembros estamos trabajando estrechamente con la Comisión en el diseño de un marco regulatorio más competitivo que impulse y refuerce el clearing dentro de la Unión Europea. Esto exigirá la adopción de medidas de demanda, como podrían ser la obligación de crear una cuenta activa con una mínima actividad en una entidad de contrapartida central de la Unión Europea, la limitación de las exposiciones a entidades de importancia sistémica o al clearing por parte de las entidades públicas. También serán necesarias las medidas de oferta, como la simplificación y agilización de los procedimientos de EMIR, así como una mejora del régimen de supervisión, con una mayor cooperación y convergencia en las prácticas de las autoridades. Así, la mejora del marco regulatorio de clearing, en su conjunto, contribuirá al cumplimiento de objetivos estratégicos de la Unión Europea, como la garantía de la estabilidad financiera actual y futura, la construcción de una verdadera unión de mercado de capitales, la reducción de la dependencia financiera en un escenario post-Brexit y el refuerzo de la autonomía estratégica, más necesaria que nunca a raíz y a la luz de los últimos acontecimientos. Allow me to finish today with a few words in English, thanking once again the National Securities Markets Commission for this event and the rest of our participants for their valuable contributions. And let me say that it is a real pleasure to have significant actors of the clearing scope, such as the European Association of CCP Clearinghouses and CCP 12 here with us today. In a context marked by uncertainty, volatility, the increase in public debt, growing inflation, and a new trend in monetary policy towards higher interest rates, financial stability arises as one of the main strategic objectives of the European Union. Clearing services and the role of central counterparty clearing houses acquire great relevance when it comes to guaranteeing this public good. Due to their strategic role, it is essential that the European Union creates a complete and competitive regulatory framework for these entities. On the one hand, we need to talk about the recovery and resolution framework, whose main goals are to guarantee that CCPs establish measures to recover from eventual financial difficulties, to maintain the essential functions of non-viable entities while liquidating the remaining activities, to preserve financial stability and to avoid a significant adverse effect on the financial system and its ability to contribute to the real economy. This framework contains both preventive and reactive measures that will create more resilient CCPs and will strengthen financial stability. On the other hand, though, in a post-Brexit context, and the European Union needs to enhance clearing capacity within our bloc and reduce our over-reliance on Tier 2 third country CCPs, something that needs to be tackled, combining both demand and supply measures and an improvement in the supervisory framework. In the complex environment that we are living in, we need to build strategic autonomy, yes, in terms of clearing, but we also must ensure financial stability by taking advantage of the infrastructures already in place. Therefore, every measure needs to be well calibrated and adopted progressively. This is why we are working side by side with the European Commission and with the rest of the member state, and this is why we are happy to be holding such an important meeting as this one in our beautiful city of Madrid. So thank you very much.